African and African American writer in the community. I'd like to say a few things about what it is we think we're doing here and how it is we think we're going to do it. That all sounds very tentative. We're sure why we're here, but we're open to surprises. And introduce our participants and tell you a little bit about the format, and then get out of your way and out of their way so that we can have a good day's discussion. First of all, some acknowledgments. I need to acknowledge with gratitude, as we have several times during the year, the support of the AT&T Foundation, which has been very generous materially in making this day possible. And also would like to acknowledge with equal gratitude the hard work of Juliana Guevara, who is the director of the Office of International Education, who both conceptually and logistically is responsible for us all being here together today. You may be seeing more of her, so you should know who she is. The lady up here in the front, on your right. I'd like to begin by explaining what it is that brought us together, what it is that got us thinking about the possibility of a discussion like today, what we mean by the title, African and African American Writers and the Community, what that relationship is about to us, and why it is that we're linking African and African American writers. It's not necessarily an obvious link, but I'd like to explain why it is that we have made it. And because I want to do that both with some precision and some conciseness so that we can get on with things, I'm going to read to you for a couple of minutes, which I wouldn't ordinarily do, and I'll ask your indulgence with that formality. However different the specific cultural traditions of one part of Africa from another, most share in common a certain kind of relationship between the verbal artist and the community. We can name some of the elements of that relationship. For example, the oral poet, under a variety of different names, griot being probably the most familiar to us, speaks directly and immediately to his or her audience. Now, that seems a fairly obvious thing to say about an oral tradition, but it seems important to say because so much flows from it. When the poet performs, it is most often upon some occasion of larger social significance in the community. For example, the dedication of an object or a space to some communal purpose, the recalling to mind of tradition and historical precedent as some important communal decision is about to be made, and so on. What that means is that the aesthetic value of such a performance is inseparable from its instrumental value in the community. The audience is often an active participant in the performance, offering a running commentary on its content and often shaping that content in the process. The poet generally holds that position, not by an act of personal will, but because he or she was elected to it by the community in one way or another. It's not simply a personal calling, but a social and even a political one. And the poet is the bearer of a tradition, a received body of knowledge and cultural understanding. All new composition and performance takes its place in a conscious relationship to that tradition. Now, this traditional relationship between artist and community in Africa should not be understood as an earlier historical stage in some evolutionary process, a stage now surpassed by other forms of literary expression. On the contrary, it is a relationship that is alive and vigorous in many parts of Africa today, and one that is not merely a vessel of tradition, but that is absolutely contemporary in the manner of its growth and the concerns it addresses. Circumstances have, however, created significant branches outward from that continuing relationship, and it's some of those branches that we want to examine today. Let me give you some examples of some of those circumstances. Many African writers have had to speak to their audiences by way of European languages, European presses, and European systems of distribution. The African writers' community has grown larger, less local, more diverse, less easily identified. Political conditions have often placed African writers in the position of addressing audiences not only different from, but antagonistic toward their own communities. Those to whom they speak and those for whom they speak are no longer necessarily the same. the African diaspora, the forced transportation of Africans to the New World as slaves, has separated people violently and permanently from their communities, forced them to constitute new and more heterogeneous communities in hostile and often culturally impoverished conditions, and has brought together in those new communities transmitted elements of traditions that were once widely separated in Africa. And it has made, that diaspora has made African American writers subject to many of the same conditions facing African writers: dependence on means of artistic production controlled by communities other than their own, artistic purposes that often lead them, whether willingly or unwillingly, to address audiences unknowledgeable about and even antagonistic toward their own community, and so on. A traditionally close, almost organic relationship between the verbal artist and the community, then, has had to accommodate enormous pressures on that relationship, both in Africa and in African communities in other parts of the world. What we are hoping to understand a bit better today is how elements of that relationship have survived, how others have been submerged, and still others have been transformed. We've invited our panelists with these questions in mind, and they represent a significant range of perspectives on our topic. I'll give fuller introductions as they come up to speak individually, but to indicate that range of perspectives, and so you know at the outset who is who, they are At Aidoo, my immediate right, a Ghanaian writer, educator, and member of government, now a resident of Zimbabwe. Mphahlele, to her right, a South African writer, critic, and educator who lived much of his life in exile in Nigeria, in Europe, and in this country, and who, having returned to South Africa, has devoted much of his work to the study of African oral poetry. Paule Marshall, to my immediate left, an American writer and educator who is professor of English at VCU, is now a member of our own Richmond community. Daryl, to her left, an American critic, folklorist, and educator who has written extensively on folk traditions in African communities, both in this country and in the Caribbean. So I think that's a very significant, very interesting range of perspectives on this topic. So that's what it is that we think we're doing and why, and who we've asked to help us do it. How we're going to do it is something I'd like to explain just a bit, the shape that we expect the day to take. We began 27 minutes ago, according to this piece of paper. I'm about to sit down and get out of the way, and we'll ask At Aidoo to speak, and then Mphahlele, and they'll take perhaps a half an hour, perhaps less, not more. And I will ask you to hold comments and questions until they've both had a chance to speak, because I think that both their remarks and your remarks will have more resonance, more of a context when they've both spoken. When they have finished, I'll ask for brief reactions, if they have them, from Paule Marshall and Daryl Dance, and then we'll talk. And we should have half an hour, 45 minutes to do that here. We'll then break for lunch, and we'll have an opportunity to continue those discussions. We have a room set aside for us over in the dining hall where we will have a chance to continue discussions begun here. We'll come back together again at 1:30, at which point Paule Marshall will speak, and then Daryl Dance. And again, I'll have you hold your comments until after they have both spoken. We'll have some reactions from Amma and from Skia, and then we'll talk until we are talked out. So that's the shape of the day. We'll begin with Amma At Aidoo. Amma was born in Ghana and educated at the University of Ghana. She was Secretary of Education in Ghana in 1982 and 1983. She's the author of, at last count, 2 plays, The Dilemma of a Ghost and a Noah, a novel, Our Sister Killjoy, a collection of short stories, No Sweetness Here, a collection of poetry, Someone Talking to Sometime, 2 books of stories and poems for children, which my children personally can recommend to you. They're one of your favorites. And I believe a recently completed novel whose title is still up in the air. She has taught at the University of Ghana, the University of Florida, the several colleges in the Great Lakes College Association, and is currently writer-in-residence here at the University of Richmond, also thanks to the generosity of the AT&T Foundation. Please welcome Ama At Aidoo.
Thank you. Thank you, Louise. Can you hear me? Please forgive me for not wanting to stand. On such a morning as this, my legging comes handy. They are not very good, and I better not stand on them this morning. If I can be heard at the mic is carrying, isn't it? Yes. Yeah. As I said, thank you very much, Dr. Tremaine. I hope that within the mandate of that I've been given this morning and the general theme for the discussion, I could use a few minutes to communicate with you about some matters that are, sort of close to my heart, and which are new and personal, as well as emphasize a few points which some of you who have had to listen to me for now nearly a dozen times or over may find quite familiar. Since I came here, and I think that the reason why I would want to use my mandate to do this morning, or at least partially, is because this panel is about African writers or writers and their communities. And definitely this has been my community for the past 2.5 months. Of course, some of you might be wondering whether you may ever stop having to listen to me. I promise you that apart from what Americans would describe as special interest groups, this is the last time, absolutely the last time I'm going to speak here publicly. There is an Akan superstition, which maintains that if you mention the name of someone you had not seen in a long time, wherever they are, they immediately sneeze. Well, when I saw a skier, I was amazed that he was still carrying his nose, because he must have, he should have sneezed it off his face for all the times I'd been mentioning his name over the past 15 months here in the United States and in Europe. A skier, it is a multiple pleasure having you here today. But then the whole panel is for me such a wonderful link-up with so much that was encouraging and inspirational, to use another American expression, in my growth and development as a writer. I was lucky, touch wood, and I can see myself then, a freshman at the University of Ghana, staring at an announcement of a writers' competition calling for quotes, short stories from young African writers. Thinking the money sounded good, I took my pen the minute I returned to my dormitory that evening and wrote a story called No Sweetness Here, and mailed it in longhand. A couple of weeks later, and before I knew whether I'd won any of the prizes, I received a telegram inviting me to a writer's workshop at the University of Ibadan in Nigeria. And a day or two later, there I was in a plane for the first time. And who do you think was waiting for me at the end of the journey? I'll tell you who. Later, when I had learned a little more about my world, I realized it was literally a who is who of the most prominent writers in my world at the time. Fancy being a freshman, college student, and getting introduced, quote unquote, as a writer from Ghana to the likes of Mphahlele, Langston Hughes, Wole Soyinka, Chinua Achebe, Christopher Kibo, and the list goes on. It sounds like a fairy tale, doesn't it? But unknown to me at the time, a pattern had been set. In the years to come, I was to be blessed with other fairy tale encounters, including meeting the very first time I went to New York, Paul Marshall. Out of this world, isn't it? But glorious as meeting both Paul and Eskia so early in my life was, for me, the real plums were their works as writers. Down 2nd Avenue, Brown Girls, Brownstones. For surely, if, as the good Chairman Mao had said, it is necessary for writers to recognize that creativity is no more than taking knowledge and other gifts from our communities and giving the same gifts back to them in a more ordered and embellished forms, then the additional imperative must be to leave for those who come after us solid, clear works. For them, those who come after us, to at least emulate and add to. So who knows how much Brown Girls inspired me to go on writing short stories until I too could actually put together a whole collection. As for Eskia, I always got his encouraging messages sooner or later. First, launching me as early as 1964 with an inclusion of In the Cutting of a Drink or Simply Cut Me a Drink in the Anthology of Modern African Writers. And 10 years later, paying my work the incredible compliment of agreeing to do a preface for the double-day edition of No Sweetness Here. But that is not even to say, that I am that much younger. Meeting both of them after so long, what I've been wondering is that I have really aged far beyond my years, or they have got the secrets of eternal youth. But thinking also back, they couldn't have been that much older than me, really. Anyhow, if I had felt recently that my portion of miracles were exhausted or getting exhausted, this panel is a reminder that I better just keep cool. There may be fewer and further between, but they can still happen. But of course, one more lesson life is forcing me to learn is that miracles really don't happen. They are created by a collaboration of people, perhaps with God, chance, gods, and other forces, depending on what you believe in. And this panel was created. I would like to acknowledge publicly my gratitude to Uliana Gabara for bringing me Eskia and Paul Marshall. Knowing her a little, I suspect she probably had to, yank a couple of arms out of their sockets to make all this possible. But she has made it possible. And again, as my Akan ancestors decreed, when a doer does, you hail him or her. So please, could you join me in saluting Dr. Uliana Gabara for this particular piece of magic? Please get up. Thank you. By the way, I keep quoting from the Akan. Perhaps I should say a little bit about who they are as part of my explanations, this morning. But because to begin with, I'm also seeing my role here as really an introducer. In Ghanaian Pidgin English, they would call what I'm doing commoges. They call everything commoges. Like when you get these big Western films, and before they see the films, some boxes or an old film of boxes will be shown to keep everybody quiet. They call it commoges. When you have a big, championship scheduled, the people who are asked to sort of keep the stage warm, they are doing commoges. So I am doing the commoges this morning. You are going to get your real treat later. But the Akan are the largest micro-national group in Ghana. And my closest point of reference, because I am an Akan. Those of you who have heard me before know that I have always avoided the term or the word tribe in speaking about Africa and Africans, because I've always felt that the term was coined by Western Euro-American anthropologists to describe societies they consider to be more primitive than their own. And since I do not share that view about my society, I do not use the term. Again, for this morning, I would like to do what I normally do, or normally like to do, whenever I have to say something about African literature. I would like to ask your indulgence and point something out which is for me extremely important, and I've done on other fora, which is that even or especially those of us who claim to be experts of the field of African literature quite often make the mistake of assuming that what we know of African literature is all that there is of it. And even more dangerous, that we use the term African literature to refer to what may just be only a small aspect of contemporary African literature written in the modern European languages. If this distinction is not made, we leave people with the impression that African literature began with the publication of Things Fall Apart in 1958. But I know that Achebe, my brother himself, and our other more prominent writers, including Eskia, would not mind having this pointed out. Because after all, the truth is that Africans have continued to write for over 3,000 years on papyrus, stone, leaves, parchment, bark, cotton, silk, and of course in contemporary times, like everyone else, on paper. But in the manner of all conquerors, the Western world has led by its archaeologists, historians and anthropologists again, and other restorers, and with the witting or unwitting collaboration of modern Egypt, has been appropriating classical Egypt, which it goes on and on. Because then, in a discussion like this, I would always want to remind us that we should not forget that any talk of African literature should go back at least to the pharaonic Book of the Dead. Not to mention, one real explosion to the tales of Aesop, because it has been said, not challenged, not said properly, that in actual fact there was no Greek called Aesop, and that the Aesop is really a transmutation of the word Ethiop, meaning African. I can quote you other people who, there's a professor at Van Settima at Rutgers University who has been for many years editing a series called the Journal of African Civilization. You can double check from Van Settima. Anyway, but I just wanted to set a few things a little straight for myself. One heartbreaking example, though, of one unacknowledged form of African writing or literature is what has happened in Sierra Leone over the last 100 years and a little more. Brutally suppressed by the British from the middle of the 19th century, indigenous Mende literature in the Mende script has shrunk from a popular literary form and become today a ritualistic, magical writing practiced by a handful. You must know about the Mende script and so on. And of course, the Igbos will tell you other stories. Some people like the Bakonga of Zaire can tell you other stories. The Akans can tell you other stories. Anyway, finally, an apology. I regret it. Finally, an apology. I regret it if sometimes over the course of my stay here, I had sounded both strident and pedagogical, but it was for a reason. I genuinely had appreciated the opportunity the University of Richmond had given me and was anxious, perhaps over anxious, to utilize it fully. This anxiety inevitably has produced its own impatience. But for us to get some clear idea of how writers also relate to their communities, we should perhaps remind ourselves of the springs out of which the verbal arts sprang. Of course, this really means looking at the beginnings of poetry, because before any other genre, there was always poetry. And at their best, both drama and prose are poetic anyway. Among all peoples, there were two basic streams of poetry right from the beginning of human time. One was the poetry that the person who worked, the worker, actually produced as a way of giving himself or herself a basic rhythm to work with, and which helped relieve the sheer strain and tedium of work. This occurred, as I said, among all peoples. They sang as they worked in the fields. People sang as fishermen rowing on the seas. People sang as they built. The other stream of poetry has had to do with people celebrating, voluntarily or under pressure, what I would like to describe as pomp and circumstance. However, it seems as if originally people's notion of real pomp and circumstance had to do with that which related to God or gods. So singing of God or the gods was the other part of the business of making poetry. The earth is the Lord's and the fullness thereof, the seas and all that there is in it. King David, the Psalms, etc. However, in time, the celebration became secularized, or at least some aspects of it, if not holy. This meant that poets turned round to celebrate the pomp and circumstance of other beings besides or apart from God, like warriors, like kings, emperors, and all manner of leaders, again sometimes voluntarily and at other times forced. In classical African poetry, this secularization of celebration continued until it became a fairly democratized process and an identifiable genre is the bongo, as in South Africa, Zulu and Xhosa, Oriki in Yoruba, Apaye in Akan. In English, they are translated as praise poetry. And the democratization continued so that now we know that in praise poetry, the subject was not always the leader and his exploits. People sang in praise of their family, the family's name, the family's exploits, ordinary members of the community, and even objects and possessions considered precious, including cattle, farm implements, boats. Clearly, the two streams of poetry I mentioned earlier have been very much a part of classical African poetry. And it is my very humble opinion that if we were just to stop for a minute being so heavy about writers and alienation, we would find ourselves admitting that writing is no more than the singing of the sum total of life itself, its sources, our struggles, our triumphs and failures, our ending. Speaking for myself, I seem to have always been interested in the issue of the writer's responsibility to her community. For in an answer to an interview as far back as 1967, I am reported to have replied that whereas the French writer Françoise Sagan, of Bonjour Tristesse and others, can write about the leisurely carryings on of lovers in Paris, I could not do the same about lovers in Accra, because I said then, surely there must be more important issues a writer should deal with in a society like ours than write about lovers. Precocious, huh? Luckily for me so far, I have lived long enough to eat at least half of those works. For in 1989, I can openly confess that I have realized that the question is not even the subject, but the treatment of it that matters. For even love is political, and how a writer writes of love is political. But of course, yours truly has not been the only one to provide an example of how the debate, on the debate of writers and their communities, precocity and word-eating appear to be inextricably intertwined. The world already knows of Shoninka and his tigritude. He can tell you the details of that story because it happened before him. But in Uganda, our Nobel Prize laureate is reported to have denied the need for committed writing because, quote, a tiger does not sing of his tigritude. Well, Shoninka too has not only lived long enough to eat all of those words, but now he is becoming quite a single tiger lately himself. Have I exhausted my 20 minutes? But if...
Go on.
Yeah, thank you. But if one single African writer embodied the entire debate, it was Christopher Okibo. Christopher Okibo was a young Nigerian poet of incredible creative energies who set out to become l'enfant terrible of modern African literature. And I would like to detail here. Writing a novel is a practical enterprise. So much word spinning, it has to be. And it is doubtful if anyone has ever embarked upon novel writing knowing full well or even remotely suspecting that his or her readers might not understand what he or she is talking about. The only obscure tale, therefore, is the one that was never told, or at least never properly told. Playwriting, on the other hand, should render its practitioner even more vulnerable. For between a script and the end of a production, the writer has to be lucid enough to have something of his or her own vision, survive all manner of cranky interpretations from producers, directors, and actors, not to mention the dampening effect of a possibly bored audience. Hardly any poet is supposed to worry about being understood, or rather misunderstood. Writing poetry is the ultimate egocentric act. If self-gratification is really a sin, then every poet should go to hell. And this is actually the status quo when the poet is functioning in a language he or she shares with his or her environment. So that when a poet is working with a language that is fundamentally alien to his background, the degree of accessibility of his or her poetry to the other people around him or her is rather reduced. Therefore, if an African poet says in an interview, quote, "There are very few Nigerians who would read poetry that appear difficult," and that Okibo, this is Okibo, he believed he was writing for, quote, other poets all over the world. And he also thought that, quote, "Poetry is at the best a mere gesture to stay within a closed society." It's my considered opinion that such a poet is erecting unnecessary barriers and loving it. That was what Okibo was doing in all his interviews from 1962. In Dover Street, London, at the Commonwealth Art Festival. This time, Okibo was being interviewed by Serumaga, I believe, for the Transcription Center. Here is Okibo. I think it is just, he claimed that he was first inspired by the deity of his village and then by the Christian God, quote him. I think it is just a way of going to the same place by two different routes. I wear an Italian jacket. I'm not an Italian. I am an African. I wear a tie and I'm very comfortable. I'm not wearing Nigerian dress. I'm not comfortable in Nigerian dress. It doesn't make me a non-Nigerian. Viewed against a background of the Civil War, which was to engulf Nigeria and in which he himself perished, these remarks are unforgivable. Okibo's attitude here almost betrays a frightening insensitivity. Worse than any neo-colonial bluff, it is a form of self-rejection symptomatic of the most obviously oppressed people, a colonial people, a neo-colonial people. As they say in Ghanaian pidgin, for me, forget it if it was made in here, say the cynical Ghanaians. Unfortunately, Okibo did not live long enough to eat his words, but he died eating them though, because in the end, he, like Lord Byron of England, thought his poetry was not good enough to say for him all that he wanted to say. So he actually took up arms to fight for the cause nearest his heart and died doing so. With the Nigerian Civil War at its height, listen to some bits of the kind of poetry he was writing then. These are all quotes from Path to Thunder. This shadow of carrion insights and in rhythms of silence urges us, gathers up our broken hidden feather of light. To this anguished cry of Moloch, what cast iron steps, cascading down the valley, all forged in this jubilee dance of fireflies. In Path of Thunder alone, there must be over 14 references to different applications of iron as a symbol of war and destruction. Horror is the order of the day, and here is Okibo, quote, "Politicians are here in this iron dance of mortars, of generators. Parliament has gone on leave, the members are now on bail, Parliament is now on sale, the voters are lying in wait. The cabinet has gone to hell, the timbers are now on fire. The cabinet that sold itself, ministers are now in jail." And we see a glimpse of the poet on his way to change, not knowing himself or maybe suspecting that he was on his way to his death. And then there was the writer from Mali, Yambo Wologom, with his novel, Le Devoir de Violence, published 1968, and in English, translated in English as Bound to Violence. Talk about a negative book. Nothing has come out of Africa, written by an African to beat this novel. The main thesis in the book is that Africans, quote, were formed and created by violence, and so we are only capable of operating in a never-ending cycle of violence. L'Audevoir immediately became the first, quote, African novel to win Le Prix Renaudot, a major French literary award. Then it got translated into English. While those Africans who read it either in the French or English translation kept asking with sheer bewilderment, why did he write such a book? What was he aiming at? Does he hate Africans and therefore himself so much? Why, Wologum? Why? Well, a piece of the Wologum story is that he became extremely famous, though, in Africa, Europe, and North America. What actually killed his reputation was that people dug out or claimed to have dug out evidence to show that so much of the novel was really a pastiche of plagiarized pieces from the writings of European travelers like Leo Frobenius and the others. At the end of such a tale, a West African pidgin speaker will simply say, "You see you." Clearly, we cannot even begin to argue about the responsibility writers owe to their community. Some of us cannot even afford to argue. Once a society has decided on where to go, it can argue endlessly about how to get there. Let 1,000 flowers bloom, said the Chinese, but then the decision had already been made for China. Maybe societies that have achieved a coherence and a solid sense of security can, argue about these issues. But to end and to demonstrate, for myself, clearly, the sort of thing I'm talking about, I would like to refer us to an NBC. NBC here, I'm giving us an example from here. An NBC sitcom called Amen, which features black people and airs at 8:30 every Saturday evening. It is the second of two programs which young people affectionately call the funnies. The first one is 227, and the second one is Amen. Is anybody here who watches these programs?
I do.
You do? Then you can tell me. There's an old black man there, very black man, black as me. What is his role? What is the?
Which show are you talking about?
Amen. He's always sitting by a table, and as soon as the play opens, he's always in the first scene with the deacon and the women sitting round, sewing and talking about church business. He's a black man, and he's the oldest and the blackest person on that program. Could he be called Raleigh? Huh?
Raleigh.
Raleigh. Yeah, it's Raleigh. Thank you. Now, this character is the oldest, like I said, and visibly old, and the blackest person there. The show is prime time, by the way. Now, as soon as the play opens, we see Raleigh sitting, like I said, by this table, and every time, like it opens with them discussing the church, church business. The show is about a deacon and his, a deacon of a black church and his, deaconesses or office workers or something. And it's a comedy. It's very funny, and I don't find much wrong with with the whole show, but except this bit. And I don't even watch TV much, but once in a while, I try to watch some of my daughter's favorites. Anyway, what I had noticed about the show is that this blackest and oldest person character is an indispensable part of the gambit. You know, in the few minutes that an episode opens, they will be discussing church business. Then out of nowhere at all, Raleigh is made to say something silly or lewd or mean, funny, you know, kind of vicious. And everybody laughs, including himself. Ha, 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 ha. Then there's a commercial, and Raleigh disappears, never to show up until the next episode. The first time I saw this thing, I was confused. The second time, I was puzzled. The third time, I was outraged. Because I was thinking, in a society where skin color matters so much, and it can truthfully be said that a real black man is put at the bottom of the intelligence ladder, how can anyone permit a regular, weekly, I tell you, reinforcement of a dangerous stereotype, which indicates that a real black man has only the capability of growing into an old fool. Last night we were arguing about Brewster Place, and so I have to make a confession. I was arguing against the notion that Brewster was negative. But perhaps once you establish that some forms of communication are negative, then it's really 6 of one and half a dozen of the other, as they say here and in other English-speaking places. But I've really been worried about Raleigh's role. And I've been thinking of Africa before we let ourselves be rendered near impotent by militarily superior powers. That in traditional Africa, an old man was not considered a fool. Far from it. The old, men and women, are those to whom the society goes for wisdom, practical and otherwise, knowledge, advice, and all the other things that one is supposed to equip oneself with to live a meaningful life. No doubt, I will, thank you. No doubt, of course, even in traditional African society, old men told silly and lewd jokes, but with their difference. It was always in company of their peers, and certainly not for the public consumption. And what had happened when Western education made us feel big in ourselves in Africa, so that we began to look down on our elders. Look at Africa and the way it is. And that is the reason why I fear for Africa, America, if the Raleighs are the kind of models which are being thrown out every week for the consumption of the youth. So the fourth time I saw Amen, I decided that something has to be done about this thing. But then I asked myself, what can be done about it? This is the United States, the home of free enterprise and free expression. People are protected by a First Amendment. And then in any case, isn't there something awful about censorship? Who decides? Who can do what and when? Which is the worst crime? Letting a certain sector of the youth in a society feed on the kind of visual and verbal art that will surely help them grow up with low self-esteem, or moving to ban the offending piece of writing. In any case, who is a writer? For a program like Amen, does he or she consider a target group as his or her community? The questions are numerous. Definitely, when a society, as we've said elsewhere, when a society feels confident in itself, and even when it is not confident in itself, but writers of that society identify their interests with the society, they sing of the hopes of the society. And this includes William Shakespeare. If you doubt, if you don't believe me, read the opening lines of King Henry V. Thank you.
Excuse me while I move some furniture. Okay. Well, Alma's made my job a good deal easier in terms of introductions of the other panelists. To move on to our next miracle, to use your words, Mphahlele was born in South Africa and educated at the University of South Africa, the University of Denver, the University of Pennsylvania. I'm not sure why I go through these pedigrees, but somehow it seems like it's important for the relationship we're talking about to acknowledge the institutions that we've passed through and that we live inside and that live inside of us. He is the author of, and this is a partial list, of 2 autobiographical works, Down Second Avenue, which is probably the title in this country at least it's most associated with him, and more recently, Africa, My Music. 2 novels, Chirundu and Father Come Home. Books of criticism and essays, including The African Image and Voices in the Whirlwind. Again, I'm naming the ones that are most familiar to us in this country. Many short stories collected in various places, most recently in a volume published by Readers International called Renewal Time. I think that's the most recent. He's the editor of 2 anthologies. Is referred to one of them. And they are Modern African Stories and African Writing Today. He has taught at the University of Ibadan in Nigeria, the University of Denver, the University of Zambia, the University of Pennsylvania. He's currently head of Department of African Literature at the University of the Witwatersrand in Johannesburg, where he's also founded the Independent Council on Black Education and Research. Please welcome Mphahlele.
I can use the podium, right?
Please.
Thank you very much indeed, Dr. Tremaine, for your kind introduction, and thank you all for sparing the time to come and share ideas with us here. It is indeed a great pleasure meeting Alma again and meeting Paule again, and I have been all the more enriched by both reading them and first reading them and then meeting them and talking with them at great length. We've bounced around a lot between Africa and the United States and in Europe. What I've been thinking a lot about the way in which my sense of community has changed from time to time as a writer. When I was in South Africa and started writing short fiction, my audience was an immediate one, the African people, black people generally, which includes all the oppressed people who are not officially known as white. That includes the Asians, East Asians, and that also includes the so-called colored people. That was my immediate audience, and I had my eyes on them all the time when I was writing. And later on, this was reinforced, I should say, by my reading Richard Wright Langston Hughes. Back in 1955, I wrote a short story which was published in this country in an anthology called New World Writing, a story called The Suitcase, and Langston Hughes happened to read it and wrote to me about it and said how much he admired it, and we carried on a friendship, a close friendship since that time, and ran into each other several times on the African continent and also here. And also reading Richard Wright's Uncle Tom's Children, it turned my head around completely. I realized that I would have to change my way of perceiving, and it did, and did also a lot for my own style. I had been writing in the grand Victorian manner in which we were brought up by missionary teachers in South Africa. I think Aman knows this. All over Africa, we copied that grand manner of the Victorians into our lives and our writing careers. That's how we started, and then we woke up. Something just hit us on the head, and we realized that we were so completely out of step with reality. And style is shaped by your social reality, as I came to find out from Richard Wright's writing and Langston Hughes, then of course read Black Boy and Native Son. Also realized that my writing needed to be more concrete. The style needed to be more concrete as it is in Native Son, in Uncle Tom's Children, and also the experiences in Uncle Tom's Children struck a common chord in me, and told me what it was that we had in common between here, the black people, the African American's life, and the South African's life. And when I realized that, it took in another dimension. I left the country, went to Nigeria, and I should say that Nigeria gave me back Africa. It restored Africa to me. Here I was, coming from a South African ghetto, completely knocked about and uprooted also. The African culture has suffered greater damage in South Africa than anywhere else on the continent. And when I came into Nigeria, and went to Ghana as well, and visited Ghana, particularly Ghana and Nigeria, when I was working in Nigeria, and came into this formidable traditional Africa. I had already become an agnostic in South Africa, and now I realized that I would have to have something more positive, and it was to be an African traditionalist in my religion. And I've been since, and believe very firmly in African humanism. So I developed a Pan-African outlook, and Africa became my community. I left in 1966 to come here, to go to the University of Denver. And the 9 years I was in this country, I was developing another community. And of course, it is quite natural for me to take up causes, the cause of particularly the cause of the oppressed African American. And that also added to my Pan-African community. and also realize how much our worlds have been intertwined, that is, the African Americans' world here and the African world. And now, today, I've gone back to South Africa, and I still am Pan-African in outlook. And when I write, I have in mind that audience. And that is how it has evolved. A writer cannot but write for an immediate audience to begin with. After all, that's your social reality. And this is what comes into your life. This is your sensibility. Right. I ask myself, what are the demands of a community and what are the writer's responsibilities? This is just to go through what Amma has said. First of all, Dr. Tremaine has talked about the aesthetic and instrumental elements of performance in traditional poetry, and also that the writer, what the writer speaks to and speaks for, are not necessarily one and the same audience. This is today, and that is crucial for the writer, that you are very often criticizing, you're critical of a society, and also critical of a government, which is not necessarily the society. And you are speaking to different audiences at different times. And then what Amma says about Mao Zedong's pronouncement that we should give back to the community what we take from them. I'm just paraphrasing that. After all, we use materials from common life, from our day-to-day experiences. And this is what we get from our environment. And we need to give back these creations to that environment. Prose drama, being both poetry, she says, and being a celebration. Writing, she says, is a singing of the totality of life's experiences. Again, I'm paraphrasing. The responsibility of a writer, she says, is not even just the subject, but the treatment of the subject. And then the question of commitment. And that word commitment has become so overused, I think in our own rhetoric, that we often forget what we are talking about. We don't specifically ask ourselves, committed to what? What is commitment for a writer? And then also how certain poets, such as Okipo, set up certain barriers which didn't need to exist. It is a very interesting feature about Okipo's poetry as well as Shoyinka's poetry. Both are very difficult poets. I never can understand what they're saying. And I put the book down. It's like reading T.S. Eliot. I don't like it. I don't like the kind of poetry where I've always got to make references and go to encyclopedia and go to reference works and do that kind of scholarly kind of enterprise. I don't like that. I want to read a poem so that it hits me, and I live it, and I'm one with it. And I should say that by and large, African and African American poetry does that. It is pretty accessible, and it is also, it is almost transparent without necessarily being shallow. Right. When they wrote about the Civil War, the poetry stretched out, as it were, that is, showing us cables. It stretched out, and you could see very clearly the drive, the meaning, the thrust of the poetry, such as the Thunder poems. Why is it that when you write a public poetry, and this is why it is so, I think, when you write a public poetry, you become simpler, and you become more readable, you become more comprehensible than when you are trying to write a private poetry, even trying to translate the inner mysteries of African life into your own personal style. It does also mean there is that kind of intimate connection between poetry and politics, which is never going to let us be, and because politics is a way of life, and also because the ancient poet talked about life's experiences. Yes, these life's experiences are all-encompassing, and that doesn't only mean resistance, battle, conflict. It also talks about tenderness, about love, about betrayal, about care, and so many other things. Larry Neal says, literature is impossible if we fail to see ourselves in more positive terms. For without a change of vision, we are slaves to the oppressor's ideas and values that finally attack the very core of our experiences. Therefore, we must see the world in terms of our own realities. This concept in which we see the world differently from the way the other world sees it is something that has gone on for a long, long time. Ever since Blyden talked about the African personality in the 19th century. We have been back and forth in our relationship to the West, I'm saying, and Western values. It has been, we've been swinging like a pendulum between approach and withdrawal, between acceptance and rejection. And it seems to me it's going to go on for a long time, as long as the West is so much with us. Wordsworth talks about the world being too much with us, late and soon, getting and spending, we lay waste our powers. But for us, the West is so much with us, too much with us. Even though I believe that we must, as Larry Neal puts it, redefine our own reality on our own terms. I believe that we must outlive that kind of reference that we always make to the West and be a substantive entity ourselves. Even though I believe that, I still find that where I come from, in South Africa, one has always to go back and replay the colonial saga and replay the values of the Western world, which our young people are not aware of. They're not aware of the kinds of things they're being sucked into. That's what I mean. And we have to keep on reminding them that, look, here is the point. There are certain things that we should not and must not emulate from the Western world, because we have our own selves, we have our own inner core, which speaks for itself. I'm saying that because throughout our literature, we are involving our communities in this dialogue that will go on, where we are saying to ourselves, how far do we go? How far do we go in this in the Western direction? And how far should we go? How far should we push our own traditional values? What traditional values should we push? And what can we simply write off as part of history? And that is what we are involved in today. I want to simply graphically list a number of points about African literature according to a very sketchy time frame. There is the pre-colonial prose, Amma has mentioned, has traced things right back to the pharaohs and so on. There is that pre-colonial prose explaining life generally, and later explaining the relationships in the encounter between Europe and Africa. This period includes poetry, narratives, letters by slaves and freed slaves. Concurrently with this, oral literature. Second, the era of colonial government, education, Christianity, a new money economy, and commercial enterprises. Concurrently with that, oral poetry. The literature of the colonial era dealing with life under European rule, attempts to resist colonial influences, African civilizations and the inner mysteries of our cultures, consciously to prove that Africa is not inferior to Europe. The corrupting influence of Western life ways, the emergence of nationalism and Pan-Africanism against foreign rule, the significance of negritude, anti-racism. 3, independence, the era of independence, the failures and triumphs of independence, political tyranny, institutional violence against citizens suspected of being enemies of the state, civil strife, civil war. Concurrently with this, there are further researches into the oral literatures of Africa today. And there are new forms of oral expression which we have to also keep in mind. And the potential in this oral expression to become something durable, something enduring. Concurrently, as I said, there are further researches into oral literature. 4, the special cases of Portuguese and South African racism. 5, the black people's burden. The struggle between the African personality and Western values. The resurgence of black consciousness as both a political and spiritual experience. The more internalized struggle to find a point of synthesis that one can live with between Africa and the West. All these constitute the black people's burden. For Europe first, and later the rest of the West, have never felt the need to adopt any feature of African culture. Yes, there have been a few stray whites in Africa who went native, but there's hardly anything to talk about. Usually the literature about these people are that they go back to Europe and just collapse and are found in the gutter somewhere to show what Africans African civilization can do to a European if he tries to go native. Right? It destroys you. Right? You become, you disintegrate. That's the thing. That kind of myth. I'm not talking about that. I'm saying white people, Europeans, as a community, if you will, have never tried to adopt any feature of African culture. On the level of material culture, there is nothing the West has needed that it could not grab by force or subtle means from Africa. A synthesis of cultures has never been a priority in the Western world. It's never been. You hardly ever hear people of the Western world talk about a synthesis between other cultures and theirs, because theirs is superior, they would think. It has always been the African's burden to try to arrange the synthesis between the West and Africa. It's always been our burden. Rudyard Kipling talked about the white man's burden when he talked about colonialism in the British Empire. Those people out there going after the outpost of civilization, you might say, and carrying with them Christianity and education, that is the white man's burden as far as he was concerned. No. It is right now a question of the black man's burden, having to work out that synthesis. Right. Having sketched this, I should move on and talk about these communities that we think we're writing for or writing to. This question of commitment, I think of commitment to truth. Commitment to truth, whether it be objective or subjective truth. That is a commitment. Commitment to the well-being of other people, which is a traditional sense of community in Africa and the black world generally. Projecting the vision of a life that can help the community redefine itself. The community has to know that it must continue to redefine itself. Hence my use of the phrase renewal time, because I see literature and the arts as a way of renewing ourselves. And so the writer has that responsibility to take the community along with him through this renewal process. And I think very often when we talk about revolution, we are thinking that is through literature and the arts. We are thinking also, not necessarily of a bloody conflict, but we're also thinking of a renewal time. That literature revitalizes language. It revitalizes language so that it rises from the ordinary pedestrian level of it's terrific, isn't it? Oh, it's awesome. Marvelous. Oh, terrific. Oh, dynamic. From that level, you've got to rise from that level to a higher level, which renews us and enriches us. Isn't that so? That's what we look for in literature and in the arts. And we're also setting out or describing for the community the loftiest aspirations of a people, so that the images one creates are both truthful as well as elevating and enriching, as well as educative. Indeed, the writer is an educator of a kind. I must go back to the Western world where remind ourselves, in the Western world, literature has become something so special, something so precious, something that involves only the people of the same intellectual level as a writer. That is what it has become. It has become an industry. Reviewing and criticism have become an industry, so that these ideas whirl around at a certain upper level, which does not involve the people and the lower stratum of society, does it? And we have been co-opted into that world, as it happens. But this, I think, was a necessary beginning, because after all, we began to write in European languages. Those of us who write in our indigenous languages have a greater advantage, because they're much closer to the very basics. But at the same time, I'm not saying we should stop writing in the European languages. I'm not going to go back into that dead-end debate which came up in the 1960s and petered out even before the end of the decade, about whether we should not be writing in African languages so that we should be truly African and truly nationalistic. I'm not going to go into that dead-end debate, because it takes us nowhere. And since then, anyhow, people have been producing so much literature in French and in English. It's something that we must live with. It's something that we must also deal with, because it is not English. It is a branch of English that says other things in other ways. We express an African sensibility in a foreign language, fine, but we have domesticated that language. When I read Ama's short story, Cut Me a Drink, I'm amazed at the way in which English is used. It's not the English at all. It's not the Queen's language. She captures the speech patterns of the people, her own people, and the way words come in from different directions. And somebody quite alien to this kind of thing might want to know, well, who's speaking here, and to whom is he speaking? And that kind of manipulation of language is what fascinates me so much in the way people can use a European language. We must realize that, having been co-opted into this club of literary people, that we have to turn back, and we have begun to turn back into ourselves, into our communities. Drama has a tremendous advantage over fiction and over poetry. A tremendous advantage, because it has an ancient tradition, hasn't it? Way back to ancient rituals. And when you stage a play for a people, you stage it to people so that they understand it immediately, and it has an immediate impact. And if there are any flaws in the play, you can do something about it right now. You can't do that with a novel. Once it's published, it goes. And this is what we are caught up in. I would like to think that, to come closer and closer to our communities, we use drama, so theater, more. I should say theater, because theater is more than just drama. It's more than just the play itself. It's the preparation for the play, it's the rehearsal, it is the staging of the play, it is the managing of the play. All that whole process is a theatrical enterprise. Now, I'd like to think that we can use that a lot. And when we do write fiction, all right, let us continue to write the fiction that we have been writing, the long kind of novel. But I would urge that we writers should think very seriously about writing for the juvenile readership and the general readership. So far, we read only in schools mostly, aren't we? And mostly in schools, the general reading public is still very much preoccupied with other things. And it has got its own poetry, you might say. We can begin to think seriously of writing for young people, as Amma has already started to do. More and more of that. For children, and also for an adult general readership. Thank you. For the working person who hasn't got the leisure and time, or even the capacity to take in a novel like Arrow of God. That kind of person I'm thinking of. We need to write pamphlet literature, such as was done in Onitsha, except that it would be better written. Better written than that kind of escapist stuff that you find on the Onitsha market. But something well written in pamphlet form, pamphlet poetry, pamphlet plays, pamphlet fiction, which you can run into in the supermarket or in the open market, anywhere, right? I'm thinking of that. When a person has read something well written, elevating, enriching, in quick time, and finishes, you feel triumphant that you have finished a book. And we should begin to do that, even particularly through our local publishing, which we must also increase and express and promote. Finally, I must say, talking about how the community responds to what we are writing, I'm reminded of the Rushdie book, and how the whole Muslim world, practically the whole Muslim world stands up in arms against the poor man. Now, well, I'm neither Christian nor Muslim, so the arguments about blasphemy are quite baffling to me. But my gut feeling is against any kind of religious inquisition. Having said that, I should also say that the people who go out here to protest against the Ayatollah and go and do public reading or public readings and so on, I think are doing themselves a disservice, because in this very country there is so much censorship going on and nobody stands up. All right, the death sentence is pretty extreme, certainly, but the very act of censorship is so common now. It's widespread all over the world. The most so-called open democracies censor so much in play production, in TV, in writing, everywhere. And there are particularly fundamentalist circles that have a tight grip on things and who are anti-humanism and tell themselves that this is wrong or this is right. And we have got that kind of censorship going. It's a kind of moral majority business, a moral majority industry, where people are always watching out for the obscene word and obscene kind of scenario, that kind of thing I'm talking about. We don't even seem to realize that we are actually taking part in that censorship, because we're not saying anything against it. Nobody says anything against it. So, setting aside the death sentence, I would say that the Rushdie thing is just an incidental kind of problem. There's a whole problem in the fact that right-wing conservative governments have taken over in this whole world and are out to stamp out the freedom of the individual and the freedom of a people. Thank you very much.
some time for discussion before we have to break for lunch. And again, when we break for lunch, there will be time to continue that discussion informally over lunch. And clearly the same discussion will roll over into the afternoon. I hope we'll all be here for it. Could I invite the two of you to offer reactions if you have them to start us off?
Well, I'd just like to emphasize the importance of looking for forms, art forms, that make a more direct connection with our communities. And that's why I'm so interested in your looking at drama as one of the forms that make that kind of direct one-to-one connection. I was reminded of a theatrical group in Jamaica, West Indies. It's called the Sister Inn. And it's just a group of working class women who have organized themselves as a sort of touring dramatic company.
Really?
And they not only put on pieces, I don't know if you call them plays as such, but dramatic pieces that come out of their own experiences as domestics, as wives, as lovers, and so on. And it is done by and large on a kind of improvisational basis. They get up on stage and they kind of speak out what has enraged them that day.
Really?
You know? But it is something that the audience there in Jamaica, especially when they tour in the countryside and so on, can respond to immediately.
Oh, really?
That this is living art.
Okay.
And it's art very much in the African tradition, where an art is not inseparable, separated from life.
Quite.
But art is part of life.
Yes, right.
And so if we could kind of move toward more of those forms.
I think so.
I certainly tried it in my own work. There was a sort of TV adaptation of my first novel, Brown Girl, Brown Stone, some years ago, and thought seriously, really trying to kind of continue writing for the theater. But then I had to deal with directors and actors.
That's where that's a crunch. That's a crunch.
And I decided I had better get very quickly back to the study, to my study of the novel.
Oh, really?
But again, I think it's very important that we start looking at those other forms.
Thank you.
Let me just comment that both speakers in their introduction said something that started me thinking and even made me a little afraid. And they were talking about a community that's smaller than the community we're really focusing on today, and that is the community of black writers. And as they talked about how they almost stumbled upon or came into this community, it made me think about the number of possible Aidoo's and Mphahlele's out there who may not see that notice on the bulletin board and who may not be drawn into the community of writers. It made me think about the fact that there certainly is more than coincidence to the fact that so much black literature was coming out of Harlem during the 20s, or out of Chicago during the 60s, or from Kingston during the 60s and 70s and 80s. It's that community of black writers is so very important as well, and that's an issue I hope we can talk about sometime.
Yes.
Okay, you're on. Comments, reactions, questions?
About 4 weeks ago, I visited this church, and there was a missionary from Africa, and he was back here in Richmond to solicit funds to buy, to start a huge school building where, I guess, seminary, you may call it, where he may train African preachers. And the concern, as I understand it from this man, was that there was a resurgence of African religion, native African religion. And the gentleman was very concerned that this could have some political overtones and, above all, that it would supersede Christianity. Do you see this resurgence of African literature? And I went up to him afterward, and I thought it was a very positive thing. But the gentleman saw it as a very negative and frightening issue. Would you mind commenting on that, please?
I'll defer to you.
Me?
Yes, I can follow.
Yeah, thank you. Is this man an African?
No, he was a white American
White
missionary.
American missionary.
Oh, then no comment.
No, but I
Yes.
would like, do you perceive that there is a resurgence of traditional African religion? And I'm very...
As you yourself have answered the question, if there were, it would be a positive thing, wouldn't it? Because the question is not even, you know, I mean, in the long run, it's not, in the long run, forgive me, but I don't think it's which God we worship, but we worship. And if Africans want to go back to their religion, I think that's for the good. And as you said, I mean, Ezekiel,
That's all right.
confessed that he had returned to, African religions. And there are others, who, I mean, among our intellectuals and so on and so forth. Tremaine shocked the Africans writers in Sweden in '86 when he gave his whole paper on how he had decided to go back to our so-called ancestral worship. I mean, again, that's a translation. But you see, the panic over our souls has always the panic over our souls from the West has always been a prelude to something terrible. I'll be very honest with you. The resurgence is an indication of the new missionary zeal in Africa, and it is not it is not healthy at all for us. And the dear Lord above knows that I don't even mean Christianity itself as a religion, but what Christianity has been used for and is being used for in Africa. So that's why I said I didn't want to comment, because it's more of what we've had over the last 200 years,
You could also, thanks a lot, you could also say that it has been a continuing development rather than a resurgence in so much of Africa, isn't it? It's something that's been continuing. Since Christianity came into our midst, there's always been this tussle between Christianity and African religions, so that African religion has often infiltrated the Christian worship and also Christian practice and also religious practice, church practice. You know the drums in the Catholic Church in Zaire, right? That kind of thing. It's interesting that this has happened because I trace it back to the way in which Christianity came into Africa. It came to destroy in order to replace the indigenous personality with the Christian soul. They destroyed the shrines of the people. It meant to crush the heathenism that they considered existed. Whereas Islam did something quite different. It used African religions and African political authorities and African religious leaders. It used those instead of trying to exorcise the traditional gods of Africa. It co-opted them. And so Islam came into Africa much more peacefully. Yes, all right, later we took to the sword. There's no doubt about it.
I was going to say something about that.
Yes, our people took to the sword, but it was after European colonization that happened. And so people got knocking their heads together, particularly in Francophone Africa. Now, I'm saying this, that when you look at an African Muslim, don't you get the impression that he's much more integrated? He's a much more integrated personality than a Christian African?
Well, that also because Islam really, right from its roots, was really a syncretic kind of thing from mainland Africa and from Arabia, from the Arabian Gulf.
Precisely.
So,
yes, quite. When you meet an African who says he's a Christian, you see distinctly two layers, one superimposed on another. The indigenous self and the superimposed religion, which often is just a nominal kind of practice. It's a kind of churchianity, you might say.
Yeah, churchianity. And actually, right now, to add to the notion that African, the Christianity itself has been embattled, what is happening in most urban environments in Africa, especially West Africa, places like Ghana, is that everybody is opening their own church, like family shrines, and people really have become priestesses,
Yes.
They have just donned the cross, some white robes, and the Bible hardly plays any role in their form of Christianity. So they really are like ancient priestesses, crying, using the name of Jesus. Much of the time, that's all. He's all they know or call upon, and the rest is a or whatever, the local version of African traditional religion is. You see.
I'd just like to make a sort of personal footnote to that. I think you can hear me without the mic. Not one of these strong voices. But to just give you some sense of the destructive nature of these missionary forms on Africa. I was in Kenya, and on my way to meet with Ngugi, who lives in a place called Karen, named after this white woman.
Of course, Karen Blixen.
Karen, yes.
So I had to deal with that first of all. I mean, this whole area named after one European woman. And got up there to Karen, trying to find Ngugi, and heard this sound that called to mind for me those Sundays when you would pass these churches that were, to my mind, the dullest of the dull. These dreary kind of Protestant hymns.
Right.
Oh God, our help in ages past kind of thing. And I heard this on this beautiful landscape, this dull, deadening sound, and saw then this group of Africans who had been gathered together by this group of missionaries, and were being taught these hymns, and I just sensed how all that was so much a part of them, their richness, their tradition, and so on, was being set aside for something that was so absent of life.
Completely absent, yes.
So dull, so dreary. And so this is, but I mean, of course, it's a form of control.
It is.
It is good.
It is.
And so it's heartening if they are returning to the traditional religions or taking Christianity and doing their own thing with it.
Yeah.
Yes.
And doing their own thing with it, yes.
Yes, please.
I know that you're quite involved in all traditions, and over the last 10 years, there's been a lot of storytelling all over the country. Do you think that is an attempt to connect with the community again?
In most instances, absolutely. I think the storytelling has been going on, it's just that it hasn't been on TV as much and we haven't been hearing as much about it, and probably there are more so-called professional storytellers which may or may not come directly out of the true oral tradition. But by and large, I'm very pleased with that.
Ms. Mphahlele, Ms. Aidoo, dealing with this dialectic between the writer and the community, you know, there's the African community and there's the Afro-American community here in the United States. In your works, how do you reconcile dealing with these two communities, these unique communities, or do you do it in one work? Or
Oh no, I don't reconcile them because I don't see them in conflict. What I do is when the mood takes me to write. When I start to write, I'm saying to myself, there's not only Africa, but there's the African diaspora, which also includes the Caribbean. And I say to myself, anybody there, I'm sure, will be able to tune into this, that kind of thing. But otherwise, you see, you are swept by what the tempo of what you are creating. You're caught up with that, right? And it's only, as it were, back of your mind that you feel, that you know whom you're writing for. You're certainly not. I say to myself, if the white world tunes in to what I'm writing, fine, it's good, if it can. But if it can't tune in, I don't say to myself, well, you know, it's therefore it detracts from the value of it. I used to worry back in the 50s. I used to agonize about the fact that because we are such divided communities in South Africa, black and white, I have no way of representing the character of white people, or a white character in the round, or adequately or effectively. I used to worry about it, and I ceased to worry about it because I said to myself, why the hell should I? I didn't create the situation that we have now, and I'm going to write about the reality of our people. That's what concerns me. That's what concerns me. We are surrounded by them. Yes, we know that, but we moved further up. Instead of simply giving attention to that, we decided that generally, I would say, South African writers they're not saying to themselves, we're contributing to English literature. No, they're saying we are contributing to the literature of Africa. And I'm sure even the diaspora will be able to tune in. And the language that is used also tells you that. Again, we get away from the orthodox, conventional English language. So it's not a matter of reconciling the two worlds. It's really a matter of already they are a world in my mind. I'm carrying this in my mind all the time.
So you're saying it's basically universal what you write.
Oh,
no.
That. Sorry.
Go ahead, Alma.
Well, I'm scared of the term now. Universal, because it has become almost like an apology for absorption. Yeah. You know, when somebody says, is your literature universal, what they're actually saying, is it Western enough for me to understand? And so some of us have become a bit nervous about the term. Yeah. But as Kia said, you know, in terms of, at any rate, to speak for myself, even before I wrote The Dilemma of a Ghost, before I came to the United States, can you imagine about an African boy coming here to marry an Afro-American girl and taking her to Africa, and what happens? And this play, The Dilemma, you know, I mean, has always been a bit of a trouble because Africans complain against it, African Americans complain against it. But for me as a writer, like he says, the need, you know, for me to apologize or even to make any overt attempt to reconcile anything has never been there, because just just 88, The Dilemma was produced by an African-American group in Pittsburgh. So that's, you know, I mean, and it's been produced in New Orleans and so on and so forth. So then it seems as if there is a validation there, you see. And remind you, we are coming from, you know, from processes that started for us. I mean, Chaucer isn't so bad, but I mean Spencer, John. Do you know John Donne, and the Pre-Raphaelites, the Romantics, Tintin Abbey? I mean, if we'll be expected, I mean, if I'm expected to appreciate all of that, Joseph Conrad, and Graham Greene, and they aren't even, I mean, Joyce Carey. Can you imagine? So how is it, I mean, that, you know, I should even be expected to defend my automatic response to the work of Paul Marshall or Alice Walker, you know, I mean, or anybody, Afro-Caribbean, do you see? Because at least there is something there. You know, there are, the fact that somebody is of African or of African descent does not necessarily mean I'm going to like their work. I've already, you know, given an example of someone like Okibo, whose poetry engages me immensely, and yet whom I found quite, you know, I mean, his early work, quite impossible. And he said he doesn't even like them at all, because he will send you to Gilgamesh, he will send you to Ezra Pound, he will send you to everywhere, you know, to all kinds of places like T.S. Eliot. So I think between Africans and African Americans, like the whole of the culture here presupposes an awareness of European culture. Do you see that when an English writer, when Angela Carter comes to the United States, she is swimming, she's here with you all. Nobody is going to say, Carter, do you understand what's happening in American literature? It's assumed. So I think that although there had not been a development, a conscious development of African American cultural awarenesses in relation to Africa, you know, it always went underground, right? You know that people were, being rid of their African identity was part of the suppressive processes that went on here. But something kept cropping up all the time. I've already mentioned the women of Brewster Place. I mean, even more important for my own education about the connections between African literature and contemporary African American literature is a work like Gloria Nello's Mama Day. It's incredible. I haven't seen, this book is so African, it's almost weird. So, yeah, we don't have to apologize or explain.
Okay. We've all been to these things before. We know there are lots more questions out here, and I could tease them out of you. I'm not going to do that because of the hour and the fact that we are going to have a chance for lots more discussion. So instead of cutting it off, I'm just going to ask us to change gears. There is lunch, speaking mostly now to those of you from off campus, there's lunch available in the dining center. Let me tell you where that is, how to get it, and where we're going to be sitting. Susan was selling lunch tickets, and there were maps. Is that still happening? There may still be maps outside the door as you walk out. In case not, it's not difficult. As you go out the door here and walk across this grass quadrangle, kind of angle to your right and head downhill. And once you get past this quadrangle, you'll see the dining center to your left on the lake. Everybody's going there, and you'll find it with no trouble. Lunch is $3.75. Some of you have bought lunch tickets. If you haven't, you just pay your money when you go in. You'll find a cafeteria style. You can just scatter and pick up what you want. I'll warn you that what you'll find is brunch here at the University of Richmond on Saturday. They don't serve breakfast, which tells you something about Friday night at the University of Richmond. As a parent, I don't approve of that, but my parental outrage doesn't carry much weight against economics at the dining center. So what you will find there to eat is brunch. Now, what's going to happen inside when you get your trays and go through and pick up what you want, you will come out and find yourself facing a couple of very large rooms where there are lots of students sitting and eating their brunch. And while it would be a temptation to go and join them, what we're going to do instead will be turn left immediately as soon as you come out of the lunch lines. Turn left immediately, go down a hall to your left, and immediately in front of you, you will see a set of double doors to what's called the West Hampton room. I'm not sure if it's labeled that way, but it's a room set aside from the others. It's a bit smaller. And that's been set aside for us so we can eat together and continue these discussions. We will meet again here at 1:30 and continue. And I very much hope you'll be with us. This morning flip-flopped in terms of how the structure of how we're going to proceed. We will ask Paul Marshall to speak for about a half an hour, and then Daryl Dance. And again, I will ask you to hold your questions and comments until they both had a chance to speak, because I think that their remarks will support each other's in a way that make your questions and remarks more meaningful. Again, we'll begin by having Amma and Askia offer some reactions as a way of beginning our discussion. So, on to Paul Marshall, who was born in Brooklyn and educated at Brooklyn College, and is the author of 3 novels in print at the moment: Brown Girl, Brown Stones, which Amma talked about this morning, The Chosen Place, The Timeless People, and Praise Song for the Widow. A book of novellas, Soul Clap Hands and Sing, a collection of stories, Rena and Other Stories, a recently completed novel, Daughters, which is scheduled for publication next year. Is that right? Mm-hmm. Watch for it. Daughters. Who's doing that?
G.B.
Putnam. Okay. Her work has been supported by numerous grants and fellowships and has won a whole string of awards, including, among others, the Rosenthal Award of the American Academy of Arts and Letters, the Langston Hughes Award Medallion, and the New York State Governor's Arts Award for Literature. She's taught at Yale, Columbia, Massachusetts, Iowa, Berkeley, and is now professor of English and creative writing at Virginia Commonwealth University. Please welcome Paul Marshall.
Thank you. I suspect that I'm going to be the only one of the speakers who doesn't get a little note slipped to me. Because I don't think I'll be going on for a half hour. Let me first of all say how pleased I am to be in the company again of my very good, long-time friends and my colleague, Daryl Dance. It's really, truly a pleasure. Small sort of mini festac again. Yes, I'm going to take a somewhat different approach to the question of community and speak about it first on a personal level. That is how the community in which I grew up shaped and defined me as a writer, and then look at community in the broader, more historical sense as I deal with it in my work and how it's dealt with in the work of other black writers. When I was a little girl, growing up in the Badlands of Brooklyn, New York, my idea of heaven consisted of 3 things: a book, a good long read of a book, 3 or 4 slightly tart and very crisp Macintosh apples, and a corner of the house out of the earshot of my mother, a woman who had the irritating habit of always sending me to the grocery store. I was, as everyone in the neighborhood described me, a book fiend. And I read any and everything, from Jane Austen to Zane Grey. Zane Grey, who used to write these blood and thunder type stories of the Wild West. My favorites, though, were the long, full-blown 19th century English novels of Thackeray, Fielding, Hardy, and Dickens. I loved Tom Jones. I loved Vanity Fair, Great Expectations, Jude the Obscure. They were the books, moreover, that my teachers, all of whom were white, encouraged me to read. And yet, as much as I loved those books and identified with the characters, especially Pip in Great Expectations, and how easily I could enter into the worlds they created, it was always there was always a kind of subtle, unstated, and nagging sense of lack. Something I couldn't quite define was missing. And then one day, browsing in the poetry section of the Macon Street branch of the Brooklyn Public Library, which was my second home, I came across a large volume of poems written by someone whose name was Paul, my name but without an E on it, Paul Lawrence Dunbar. And to my surprise, when I looked at the picture of the poet on the back of the jacket, he was black. This was the time, of course, and I'm talking about back in the late 30s and 40s, when there wasn't even a Black History Day, never mind a Black History Month. Curious, I opened the book at random. Little brown baby with sparkling eyes, come to your pappy and sit on his knee. Well, at first I had a little trouble with the dialect. Nonetheless, the poem spoke to me about the close and loving relationship I had with my father. So I flipped to another page. Lias, Lias, bless the Lord. Don't you know the day's abroad? If you don't get up, you scam, there be trouble in this camp. I laughed right out loud in the strictly enforced quiet of the Macon Street Library, because that poem sounded just like my mother did in the mornings when she yelled at my sister and I to get out of bed. This was good stuff. I read on. Seen my lady home last night. Jump back, honey, jump back. Held her hand and squeezed it tight. A poem about love between a black man and a black woman. You talk about the politics of love. Something I'd never seen written about anywhere before. And I began to understand then what that nagging sense of lack I'd been feeling all along was about. I was finally able to define what had been missing in all of my reading, namely books, stories, poems, plays that dealt with my experience, with what it was like to be a girl and then a young black woman living in a big city in America in the late 30s and 40s. Where were the books, the poems, the plays about me and those like me, and the community in which I grew up? Which was this community? A marvelous mix of Afro-West Indians just up from the islands, Afro-Americans just up from the South, the Scotch-Irish who still owned the houses, most of the houses in the neighborhood, the Jews who owned all of the stores, and the Italians who plied up and down my block selling fruits and vegetables from their little horse-drawn carts. A microcosm of America. No books about that world, and especially about Bajan Brooklyn, which was the part of that community I knew best, since my parents were from this tiny little island of Barbados in the West Indies and called themselves Bajans. Dunbar, his black, eloquent face, his large volume of poems legitimized my world for me. In his use of the Afro-American dialect, I heard black English, West Indian style, that my parents and their friends spoke. And it was all right to speak that way, Dunbar said to me. That too could be poetry, something worthy to be placed between the covers of a book. Moreover, when I began to write, Dunbar pointed me in the direction I would go, to give voice to a people and a culture whose voices and lives were nowhere to be found in the literature. I started with those whom I consider the caretakers of the Afro-American community wherever it is found, the women. In my case, the caretakers were my mother and a small circle of her friends who used to gather periodically in the kitchen of our house to talk. They personified the world of Bajan Brooklyn for me. They were extraordinary women, the mother poets, I call them. Poets on a par with Dunbar, although they never put a word of their poetry on paper. Poetry, art, was simply part of life for them. They created art on the spot. And they used this special brand of poetic black English they spoke to talk about everything under the sun. Life, death, war, taxes, the white people in Flatbush they worked for as domestics who would run them down. The economy, the church, God, men, husbands, sex. A woman in the community who might be a little too free with her sexual favors was known in their vernacular as a thoroughfare. The sense of men like a steady stream of cars going up and down the road of her life.
That's lovely.
They talk politics and politicians, constantly invoking the name of Marcus Garvey, the black nationalist leader who had been their political god when they first came to America in the 20s. Garvey, who spoke for working class black women like themselves. They marched in his great parades up 7th Avenue in Harlem. They supported his movement with contributions from their small salaries. And when he declared that we should all return to Africa, they bought shares in his ill-fated steamship company to help buy the ships. It's unlikely that the mother poets would have gone with Garvey on his ships had he realized his dream. They were too busy buying the houses that the Scotch Irish no longer wanted. Yet their support of his dream suggests their strong identification with Africa and the larger world of people of color. This was to have a profound effect on the way I would treat the concept of community later on in the work. In a word, these women and the community they embodied became the force and the voice behind my voice. Virginia Woolf, in her manifesto to the woman who would be a writer, and I'm speaking here of her book, A Room of One's Own, has said, and I'm quoting, "Books are not single and solitary births. They are outcome of many years of thinking in common, of thinking by the body of the people, so that the experience of the mass, meaning community, is behind the individual writer's voice," end quote. She's speaking to the fact that a writer's work is informed by the world which has nurtured her, while at the same time, that work informs that world of itself. This was certainly true of my first novel, which is in part the story of the mother poets and the world of Bajan Brooklyn. And speaking of the writer's relation to his or her community, you might be interested to know how the mother poets specifically and Bajan Brooklyn in general reacted to the book when it was first published. It came in for a mixed reception, to say the least. They were pleased and proud on one hand that I had written a book. As they put it, this big book. She write a big book. But they were most displeased, on the other hand, that I had, as they said, told the truth. She write this big book, but why she had to tell the truth? At any rate, there it was, the truth, or as close to the truth as I could get, recorded in the belief, which I share with other black writers, that in writing about ourselves and our communities as we truly are, with our faults as well as our virtues, that we are performing a healing, a liberating act. Because once we see ourselves reflected in all our complexity in books and stories and poems, a transforming process begins. We are assured of our right to be in the world. I'm talking about feelings of self-worth. And this sense of our right to be in the world provides us in turn with the kind of psychological and moral strength needed to take charge of our own liberation. Nobody's going to do it for us. Writing, in other words, as an empowering act. This is perhaps our most important role as black writers in relation to our communities. A brief word now about community in the broader, more historical sense as I deal with it in the work. At the end of my first novel, Brown Girl, Brown Stones, the young heroine rejects the materialism and insularity of the Bajan community and leaves Brooklyn for the West Indies, where her parents are from. In seeking to define herself, she feels she must know and understand that world that is the larger part of her heritage. The tight little world of Beige and Brooklyn has expanded out to a larger circle, just as what happens when a pebble is thrown into a lake, causing ever-widening circles in the water. In my second novel, set in the West Indies, the heroine leaves the islands for Africa at the end of the story. Ostensibly, she's going to make peace with her estranged husband who lives in East Africa. Yet, at another level, it is a search for the larger historical self, that extended sense of community which she needs in order to redefine herself in a more positive way. Sometimes a person has to go back, she says, really back, to have a sense and understanding of all that's gone into making them before they can go forward. The circle widens. The two books retrace the triangular route of the slave trade, going from Barbados to Brooklyn to Benin. They chart a return that is symbolic for me of the African sensibility that lies at the heart of Afro-American culture, the culture we have fashioned in this hemisphere. It's what the anthropologist, and I think he might be the only anthropologist whom you might not complain about. It's what the anthropologist Melvin Herskovits calls the life ways of Africa, which have persisted in our communities in the States, in the West Indies, and in Latin American countries like Brazil and Colombia. These life ways of Africa, which inform our music, our dance, our manners, what Ralph Ellison calls our field of manners, which informs our religious expressions, our sense of life, our style, the way we walk the walk and talk the talk, the hand on the hip, the suck teeth, the small things and the large. The life ways of Africa continue to serve as a bridge between us and our origins. They extend our sense of community beyond the limits of this hemisphere to embrace the larger world of people of color. Moreover, they keep the connection intact whether we are aware of it or not. In my most recent novel, my heroine, this time who is a middle-aged, middle-class, very proper black bourgeoisie widow from North White Plains in New York, which is some very expensive real estate. This widow of mine undergoes a series of experiences while on a cruise to the West Indies that permits her to rediscover the life ways of Africa and to re-enter the cultural community that she has rejected in her sort of scramble up the proverbial ladder. She re-enters by way of the dance. One night on the tiny island of Carriacou, just off Grenada, she finds herself caught up in a dance that is at once Mother Africa and Africa of the diaspora. And as she dances, she is both liberated and restored. Avie began to dance then. Her feet, of their own accord, slowly rediscovered the old steps. Her hips, under the linen dress she wore, began to weave from side to side on their own, stiffly at first, and then in a smooth, wide arc as her body responded more deeply to the drumming. And the movement in her hips flowed upward so that her entire torso was soon swaying. Arms bent, she began working her shoulders in a way the shouters she remembered in the church long ago used to do, thrusting them forward and then back in a strong casting off motion. Her head was arched high, all of her moving suddenly with a vigor and passion she hadn't felt in years. and that something of the stylishness and sass she was once known for. "Girl, you can outjangle Bojangles," her husband Jay used to say to her at the Saturday night at-home dances when he would turn the floor over to her. Yet for all of the sudden unleashing of her body, she was being careful to observe the old rule. Not once did the soles of her feet leave the ground. Even when the big drum reached its height in a tumult of voices, drums, and the ringing iron, and her arms rose to hail and embrace the night and the oversized stars, her feet still held to the restrained glide and stamp, to the rhythmic trudge, to the carrier-coup tramp, to the shuffle designed to stay the course of history. Thank you.
All right.
You're right, you didn't get a note. What a disappointment. That's what I'm here for, slip notes to people. Okay. We're especially pleased to have our final speaker, Daryl Dance, here, both because of her particular professional interest in our topic as a folklorist, looking at the ways in which the community imagination expresses itself, the way in which the community imagination responds to figures placed before it, and also because she is so much a product of this particular community, or one of the particular communities, at least in Richmond, or many of them perhaps. She is a native of Richmond, educated in the state, and is the author of several books, including Shuckin' and Jivin', subtitled Folklore from Contemporary Black Americans. The author also of Folklore from Contemporary Jamaicans, 50 Caribbean Writers, a biobibliographical and critical source book, and of Long Gone, which is a fascinating book, especially to people in this state, I think, which deals with the Mecklenburg Six and the theme of escape in black folklore, as well as chapters and articles on literature and folklore and scads of books and journals. She's taught at Virginia Union University, at Virginia State College, at the University of California at Santa Barbara, and is currently professor of English at Virginia Commonwealth University, and is a very active member of the Richmond community as a speaker, a volunteer, and a consultant. Yeah.
Thank you. I've done many foolhardy things in my life, including coming out today when the doctor told me I should stay in bed. But the most foolhardy of all is to follow these speakers who've appeared before me today. I'd like to begin by reading a poem from Mary Evans' Night Star. Ebb with the flow of this soft movement, people being. Gullah counterpoint jabbing the swamp under breath, gullah laughter taming the fetid forest, moss-hung lairs for bony black-kneed ghost, silent tracking their grands. Ebb with the flow of this soft movement, salt-damped feet moving to water rhythms, white-sanded through dimness, keening mysteries, saying the road, devouring the distance from here to there. The ebb and flow of this soft movement, now the circle be unbroken. People being, ghosts tracking their grands, moving to water rhythms, devouring the distances from here to there until the circle be unbroken. How effectively Mary Evans has captured here the essence of the goal of Black American writers from their beginnings on these shores, seeking to assert their humanity, people being, to maintain their unity, to keep the circle unbroken. For the most part, Black writers have written out of a commitment to community, which is, of course, the circle unbroken. The first form of Black literature to achieve any degree of popularity in this country was the slave narrative, hundreds of which were published during the 18th and 19th centuries. The narratives might seem to be the most individual of texts, focusing on one person, proving and legitimizing his or her being, recounting his or her experience in slavery and the factors leading to his or her escape, and generally ending with his or her taking a new name. On one level, then, the narrative from beginning to end reflects the fact, as Henry Louis Gates Jr. has observed, that the slave narrative represents the attempt of blacks to write themselves into being. This apparently individual story is ultimately not, however, an individual story. The similarity of the structure of these narratives is a clear indication that there was a group pattern that the narrators were following. And each story was told, molded, modified, with a consciousness of its impact on the black community. There was an awareness of the fact that they were doing what storytellers consistently do in the folk community, perhaps less self-consciously. As Ralph Ellison put it, we tell ourselves our individual stories so as to become aware of our general story. Thus, as Gates has noted, the black slave's narrative came to be a communal utterance, a collective tale rather than merely an individual's autobiography. Each slave author, in writing about his or her personal life's experiences, simultaneously wrote on behalf of the millions of silent slaves still held captive throughout the South. Each author, then, knew that all black slaves would be judged on this published evidence provided by one of their numbers. The slave authors, therefore, had to satisfy the dual expectations of shaping the random events of their lives into a meaningful and compelling pattern, while also making the narrative of their odyssey from slavery to freedom an emblem of every black person's potential for higher education and the desire to be free. The end of slavery in no way affected the black writer's obligation to his community. Facing the vicious stereotypes perpetuated by white fiction, minstrel shows, and the media, and particularly accepted myths about the Negro, the black writer set out to counter them by portraying blacks who were as virtuous, as Christian, as sophisticated, as educated, as clean living, as industrious, indeed as white as any ideal white American. And it is important to note that in most instances, these models of virtue and rectitude created by black writers were very fair-skinned Negroes. When the early Negro writers turned to the truly black character, these authors usually pictured him as a lower-class, illiterate, sometimes happy-go-lucky comic character. Rarely, however, did their portraits end here as they did in plantation school literature. Most of these writers went further and delved beneath the exterior to show us something of the man behind the thick dialect and the laughing face. And when they did this, this lower-class Negro came out as something quite different from the docile, satisfied servant and foolish clown he was in the minstrels and in much of the white fiction of the period. Rather, he took on some of the shrewdness of Brer Rabbit and Slave John of the folk tradition. Clearly, these writers were attempting to present a literature to which their basically white audiences could relate, attempting to create characters similar to those characters white readers had come to know and to expect, while at the same time cautiously but determinedly insisting upon establishing the humanity of the whole black community. With the Harlem Renaissance of the 20s appeared writers who asserted their independence from the restraints and demands of both the larger literary community and the more immediate black community. Writers who often dealt with elements of the black community that all too often skirted the hated stereotypes. Writers who sometimes directed their scathing satire against elements of the black community. Writers whose language, tone, allusions did not always reveal how far they had risen above the ghetto into the high culture that they were to presumably emulate. Langston Hughes's daring assertion that we younger Negro artists who create now intend to express our individual dark-skinned selves without fear or shame was reflected in much of the literature written by the younger writers. But even though there were some conservative voices that claimed that the Renaissance writers' portrayal of certain aspects of black life and characters was harming the black community, the truth is that these writers were by and large seeing this community with a new and more appreciative eye, and indeed reaffirming its strengths. There is no more symbolic indication of that than the Jean Toomer of Cain. Toomer grew up estranged from the roots of the black folk tradition, but after a trip to Georgia, during which he was immersed in the black folk culture, he returned to write his paean to blackness, Cain. He comments on this work.
The beauty and the full sense of life that these books contain are natural elements like the rain and sunshine of my own sprouting. My seed was planted in the cane and cotton fields and in the souls of black and white people in the small southern town. My seed was planted in myself down there. Roots have grown and strengthened. Unlike Toomer, who entered the circle late and who soon withdrew from it, Langston Hughes was always firmly rooted in his folk tradition and found an affinity with the common black man wherever he traveled, in this country, the Caribbean, or Africa. In Haiti, where he found people divided according to color and whether or not they could afford shoes, he noted, "Well, I personally preferred the people without shoes." His sense of the importance of the black community and its impact on him as a writer is reflected in this passage that I'd like to read from his essay, The Negro Artist and the Racial Mountain. But then there are the low-down folks, the so-called common element. And they are the majority, may the Lord be praised. The people who have their nip of gin on Saturday nights and are not too important to themselves or the community or too well-fed or too learned to watch the lazy world go round. They live on 7th Street in Washington, on State Street in Chicago, and they do not particularly care whether they are like white folks or anybody else. Their joy runs bang into ecstasy. Their religion soars to a shout. Work maybe a little today, rest a little tomorrow, play a while, sing a while, oh, let's dance. These common people are not afraid of spirituals, as for a long time their more intellectual brethren were, and jazz is their child. They furnish a wealth of colorful, distinctive material for any artist because they still hold their own individuality in the face of American standardizations. Most of the writers of the Harlem Renaissance believed, like Hughes, that the black community did not need to prove itself as good as anybody else, that it did not need writers who feared to reveal aspects of it to the larger community, that it needed loving members within the circle who could appreciate and share the beauty and truth, the strengths and foibles of its life and traditions. Rather than deny any aspect of that community, these writers acclaimed its music, its folk tales, its rituals, its festivals, its speech, its folk characters. They were beginning to realize that the goal should not be to break out of the circle, but to enter it. And that circle, more and more of these writers were beginning to realize, stretched to Africa and the Caribbean, and writers like Langston Hughes and Zora Neale Hurston were reaching out to join hands with this ever-widening circle that they were beginning to study and to reclaim. By the time of the 60s, we moved into the militant period with a group of young writers who felt a commitment to return to the community. But unlike the Renaissance writers, they moved into the community to teach and to revolutionize it. They viewed the community as too often lost and destroyed by its assimilationist tendencies. They wanted to preach what they proclaimed was a new doctrine of racial pride. All too often, they failed to recognize expressions of that pride and indications of that strength already ingrained in the community and its established institutions. They insisted upon providing the symbols of that pride in their hairstyles, African garments, and language. All too often, however, these writers embraced a community of blacks while they repudiated a community of Negroes, for they established very firm guidelines that determined who could be within the circle. And they preached expulsion of those traitors, those Uncle Toms who didn't embrace their symbols and espouse their revolutionary rhetoric. Thus, those who wore a wig or straightened their hair, who called themselves Negroes, who were Christians, who didn't address their dashiki-clad brethren as brother or sister and give the soul shake, and who had friendly alliances with the white community, were repudiated. Consequently, while these writers went into the community and were often effective in teaching a new pride to some, in influencing greater political awareness, in establishing cultural centers and educational institutions, in resurrecting black history, art, and literature, and in beginning to demand a new aesthetic that grows out of the black cultural tradition, they limited their circle and all too often factionalized the very community they were attempting to help. Excuse me. While the militant writers tried to impose a definition on the black community, the writers who have risen to prominence in the last 10 or 15 years have, it seems to me, been proselytizers for spiritual healing that can only be realized when those individuals who are lost rediscover the restorative powers of the black community. And community as defined by these writers includes not only the living, but also the dead, the ancestors. As Erna Brodber has Nellie assert in the novel Jane and Louisa Will Soon Come Home, the voice belongs to the family group, dead and alive. We walk by their leave, for planted in the soil, we must walk over them to get where we are going. Our dead and living had no stone encasements. Miss Anne and her son Charlie, whites, are tombed and harmless. Our dead and living are shrouded together under zinc, sweet potato slips, and thatch. Step warily. One body raises itself into a mountain of bodies which overtop to form a pit or a shelter for you. The community in the works of these writers includes not merely a body of people living and dead, but all of their rituals, dance, language, folklore, song. Through rediscovering ancestors and through recognizing those traditional practices that unified the black community, the personae in these novels re-enter the circle. These stories are also both individual and group stories, for in most of them the individual protagonist may be seen as a microcosm of the community, and conversely, the community may be seen as a macrocosm of the individual. Victimized and split by its history, losing touch with its traditions, seeking its identity by pursuing varied paths, seeking to determine and separate good and evil, and engaging in the rites of renewal. The illustration par excellence of these recent works is Paul Marshall's praise song for the widow, in which her protagonist, Avie Johnson, does not at first know that she is ill or recognize that she and her deceased husband had sold their souls to the devil in their efforts to escape poverty and achieve material comfort. Her illness finally manifests itself when her stomach begins to feel uncomfortable and bloated whenever she is faced with anything that reflects the artificial life that she has created for herself outside of the folk community. Avie's journey toward salvation begins with the appearance of her great-aunt Cooney, who comes from the spirit world to lead her niece back to the black community and thus to wholeness. Aunt Cooney is a stubborn old woman who refuses to allow others to dictate to her and who kept alive the memory of the slave ancestors who walked the water back to Africa, a memory recalled in a dramatic story recounted to her by her grandmother, a story that she persistently tells Avie as a child, telling her this story at the site of the landing where it occurred. They just turned and walked on back down to the edge of the river here. They had seen what they had seen, and those Igbos were stepping. They just kept walking right on out over the water. Now, you wouldn't have thought they'd have got very far, seeing as it was water they was walking on. Besides, they had all that iron on them. They just kept on walking like the water was solid ground. Left the white folks standing back here with their mouth hung open, and they'd taken off down the river on foot, stepping. And they were singing by then, so my gran told me. When they realized there wasn't nothing between them and home but some water, and that wasn't giving them no trouble, they got so tickled they started into singing. They sounded like they was having such a good time, my gran declared she just picked herself up and took off after them, in her mind. Her body, she always used to say, might be in Tatum, but her mind was long gone with the Igbos. When the deceased Aunt Cooney returns in a dream, the adult Avie resists her, and during their struggle, Aunt Cooney tears off Avie's fur stole and other expensive clothing. Avie then begins to ritualistically cast off all the symbols of her false life, begins to relive her past with a new awareness, and then sets out on an excursion, as Paul has told us, to Carriacou with Lebert Joseph. She finds herself on a dilapidated old boat with a figurehead of the crucifixion, where she experiences the middle passage of her ancestors in the whole of the ship, undergoes a purging, and becomes a baby again who must be cleaned and cared for by others. Once in Carriacou, she is purified by the ritualistic bath Lebert's daughter gives her. The inexplicable illness in her stomach mysteriously disappears as she continues her journey towards rebirth. At the big drum ceremonies, Avie is pulled into the circle of those doing the nation dances. Unconcerned about clothing and dressed in the plainest garment, she moves to the rhythms of the music in that passage Paul has read for us. Avie, in re-entering the circle, re-enters the community, recapturing her history and thus herself. She is now, to quote Paul Marshall, centered, restored to her proper axis. Here, the music and the dance serve as atavistic ties that connect her with her past, her family, her nation. At this point, she recognizes those other rituals in her life that had, and I quote, reached back beyond her life to join her to the vast unknown lineage that had made her being possible. And this link, these connections, heard in the music, had both protected her and put her in possession of a kind of power. The novel closes with a promise of action based on Avie's new knowledge and rebirth. Avie resolves to testify wherever she goes and to religiously pass on the story her aunt had kept alive for her. She would take her grandchildren and others to the landing. It was here that they brought them, she would begin as had been ordained. They took them out of the boats, right here where we're standing. And thus ends Praise Song with the promise that now the circle be unbroken. A similar journey towards discovery of community and entry into the circle is undertaken by Nellie, the protagonist in Erna Brodber's novel, Jane and Louisa Will Soon Come Home. After suffering a total psychic collapse, Nellie is led to health by Baba, a godlike figure who has much in common with Marshall's Lebert. Baba leads Nellie to renounce the false gods she had been pursuing, to appreciate the community, and to find her own language. He performs a laying on of hands and then prepares the way for her entry into the world of the dead, where her dead Aunt Alice becomes her guide. Aunt Alice has much in common with Aunt Cooney. Again, as in Praise Song, music in this novel becomes an important tie with the black community that Nellie is finally entering. After her journey through the spirit world, Nellie is confused until she hears the music. Then it all fitted in. Nellie's restoration is also presented in terms of a birth, rebirth, resurrection, and ends with a promise of action, just as does Avie's. Nellie bids farewell to her dead ancestors and declares, "We are getting ready." Another reminder that now the circle be unbroken. When we meet Velma Henry of Tony Cade Bambara's The Salt Eaters, she has suffered such emotional stress that she had attempted to commit suicide. Recognizing even before her breakdown that the truth was in one's own people, Velma knew even then that the key was to be centered in the best of one's own traditions. And she had thought, and I'm quoting here, she knew how to stay poised and centered in the work and not fly off, stay centered in the best of her people's traditions, and not be available to madness. But she was wrong. Velma's journey towards wholeness begins in the Southwest Community Infirmary, which combines scientific and spiritual modes of healing. Thus, after the doctors have tended her body, 12 spiritual healers sit in a circle around Velma. And Minnie Ransom, the fabled healer of the district, who also has the power of curing through a laying on of hands, is the main person who is trying to lead her to health. I quote, after Minnie lays her hands on Velma, "Velma would remember it as the moment she started back toward life, the moment when the healer's hand had touched some vital spot." Music is also important in Velma's cure, for it is the music from an annual community festival that takes her far back into her collective unconscious and prepares her to dance on through the streets in the direction of resurrection. Here, too, Velma's healing is presented in the language of a birth, rebirth, resurrection. The patient turns smoothly on the stool, head thrown back, about to laugh, to sing, to shout. No need of Minnie's hands now. Velma's eyes examining her own hands, fingers stretched and radiant. No need of Minnie's hands now. So the healer withdraws them, drops them in her lap, just as Velma, rising on steady legs, throws off the shawl that drops down on the stool, a burst cocoon. Again, the novel closes with the assurance that now the circle be unbroken. Toni Morrison's Setha of Beloved may not be educated, sophisticated, and middle class like Avie, Nellie, and Velma, but these are the only dissimilarities. Setha, like them, is a black woman being destroyed by an illness that she doesn't recognize she has. In her case, the guilt of killing her baby to protect her from slave catchers, and a false pride that isolates her from a community that she expects will castigate her. Setha, isolated from her community, stays cooped up with her daughter in her home at 124 Bluestone Road, commonly referred to merely as 124, a home surrounded by a pool of red and undulating light, an evil or a sad spirit that has kept everyone away from 124 for 18 years. When, after 18 years, Paule D. broke through that pool of red light and entered 124, Setha had almost forgotten how good it felt to have someone to share something with, even if it was a sharing of grief. Indeed, a part of her cure requires a return to the past, a digging up of old rememories that she had repressed. She worked hard to remember as close to nothing as was safe. Not only had she feared attempting to deal with the past, her past pain had taught her not to count on the future, and not even to attempt to live in the present. In effect, Setha was as dead as the skin on her back, which had been dead for years because of a brutal beating. She could not feel anything on the sculptured skin of her back, and she feared allowing herself to feel anything, anywhere, period. Paule D. awakens her passion, and in other ways begins to nurse her back to life. But afraid of what his response will be if she tells him about her past, she decides that the future was a matter of keeping the past at bay. One of the first things Paule D. does as he leads her back to feel, to look back at the past, and to believe in the future, is to take her out to a fair. But her journey to wholeness requires dealing with someone from the spirit world. And just when she seems poised to enter life and the community again, Beloved steps, fully dressed, out of the water, and confronts Setha with the horrendous deed that she had committed. It becomes obvious that Setha must either be consumed by guilt and thus destroyed, or she must escape that guilt and be redeemed. Initially, it appears that she will be consumed. The spirit daughter Beloved becomes a big pregnant mother figure, and Setha wastes away to the point where she looked like a little girl beside the ghost. Here, unlike the other novels, the spirit from the other world is not a wise ancestor figure attempting to guide the sick soul to salvation. Rather, it appears that Beloved is for the most part a greedy and malevolent spirit, hungry for love, but also determined to be avenged. Nonetheless, her appearance and her trial seem a necessary step in Setha's salvation. For it is when the community learns that there is an avenging spirit eating up Setha that they put aside their antagonisms and determine to save her. Morrison writes, "It was Ella, more than anyone, who convinced the others that rescue was in order. She was a practical woman who believed there was a root either to chew or avoid for every ailment." We recognize immediately Ella's kinship to those three other oddballs who were pariahs in their world, who trusted the potency of roots, and who were instrumental in the salvation of our other sick heroines. Ella enlists the other women in the community, and for this difficult battle for the soul of their neighbor, they gather all the various kinds of weapons they might need: Christian faith, some unnamed resources, presumably roots, amulets, and charms, and their music. Apparently, they regard the Christian faith as the least potent of these weapons. "Shall we pray?" asked the woman. "Uh-huh," said Ella. "First, then we got to get down to business." It is apparently the power of the women's singing, however, that provokes the necessary transformation, a transformation reminiscent of similar scenes in Jane and Louisa, the Salt Eaters and Praise Song. The singing carries Setha back to the clearing, the site where her mother-in-law had carried on services and taught the black former slaves to love themselves. The singing brings her to her open door. And then Morrison writes, "Building voice upon voice until they found it, and when they did, it was a wave of sound wide enough to sound deep water and knock the pods off chestnut trees. It broke over Setha, and she trembled like the baptized in its wash. And the ghost of Beloved disappeared. Some say exploded right before their eyes." Setha's rescue by the community is followed by the return of Paule D., who started her on her journey. He returns, and as he prepares what we know will be a ritualistic bath for her, we realize that he is the apostle whose laying on of hands will effect the ultimate cure. Finally, Setha is able to plan for a future, as Paul D. reminds her. Setha, me and you, we got more yesterday than anybody. We need some kind of tomorrow. Again, we close on the assurance that the circle be unbroken. How am I doing with time?
You're doing fine.
Octavia Butler's full focus in her novel, Kindred, is on the protection of the community through the assumption of the responsibility of the living to re-enter and preserve the dead ancestors. In this work, which is something of a contemporary slave narrative, Edana, who lives in Los Angeles in 1976, is frequently called back to the slave past to protect the life of her somewhat obnoxious slaveholding forefather. She must endure slavery, beatings, and indignities of every sort, including conspiring with him to seduce her great-grandmother, for to allow him to die, or for her to protect her great-grandmother from his lust, would be to destroy her ancestral line. Once she has protected her line, assured that the circle be unbroken, she kills her white slave master and great-grandfather and returns home to 1976. The community is so important in Morrison Sula and Gloria Naylor's Women of Brewster Place that it might be said to be the protagonist in both works. I might note also that these two works share numerous similarities with the works I've been discussing. I should also note that a number of works by male writers picture protagonists with similar dilemmas as those I've been discussing today. Protagonists setting out on similar quests. Works such as Ralph Ellison's Invisible Man and Flying Home, David Bradley's The Cheney'sville Incident, Edward Brathwaite's The Arrivals, Earl Lovelace's The Dragon Can't Dance, V.S. Naipaul's A House for Mr. Biswas, he might not like to be here in this list, Dennis Williams' Other Leopards. But with the exception of Brathwaite, the circle with the men is often a circle that entraps rather than unites. And their journey often ends in a confused sense of self, with them in a hole or up in a tree or on a stretcher, still helplessly wrestling with the meaning of their journey. But there are numerous other Caribbean and American works, particularly by women, that treat the journey that I have described today of sick protagonists finding wholeness within the community upon understanding and embracing its language, its songs, its dances, its rituals, its festivals. Among these novels that in varying degrees portray comparable journeys are Alice Walker's Meridian and the Color Purple, Gail Jones's Corregidora, Toni Morrison's Song of Solomon and Tar Baby, Joan Cambridge's Clarice Cumberbatch Want to Go Home, Merle Hodges' Crick Crack Monkey, Z. Edgell's Speak a Lamb, Gloria Naylor's Linden Hills and Mama Day, and Brodberry's forthcoming Mael. All of these novels have numerous similarities in their treatment of female characters and an occasional male who experience an emotional, mental, and/or physical illness, often described in terms of a symbolic death, and who display similar symptoms. They share also their exploration of the process of psychic healing that grows out of a community, is usually mediated through a female and/or an ancestor figure, and moves each character towards a cleansing transcendence, a spiritual rebirth, a psychic wholeness, a revelationary discovery, a reclaiming of self within the Black community, and a personal liberation. With most of their personae, we rejoice in the soft movement of people being. Moany, black-kneed ghosts, silent, tracking their grands, ebb with the flow of this soft movement, salt-damped feet moving to water rhythms, devouring the distances from here to there. Now the circle be unbroken.
Wow, that's absolutely staggering. Yes, I am really greatly moved by both Paul and Daryl. Paul's narrative of how she grew up in Brooklyn and
Can you speak up a bit?
oh. Should I speak up? Well, no, it's okay. I can. No, my voice is quite odd, I'm sure. I'm highly impressed by and moved by both Paul and Daryl. Paule's growing up, process of growing up in Brooklyn is specifically for me very, very moving. Also, the manner in which she discovered her community after reading all those Victorian and other novels, and then she stumbles on the Paul Laurence Dunbar, and finds just the thing that would give her a guide, what direction she should take. That's very informative. Also, the concept of mother poets. That's distinctively a moving image. Mother poets. We often forget that poetry lies right there among those people whom others would simply regard as the lower strata of society and insignificant. The language they speak is a sheer poetry. The images, the metaphor is sheer poetry. And also her concept of writing as an act of empowerment. That also is a significant point to make. Her process of finding community in the historical sense is also part of the self-discovery, when her characters, her heroines, move outward, widen their own circle of community, and go to the Caribbean and go to Africa, that kind of movement. And we are back, as it were, to the image of the black Orpheus, aren't we? The Orpheus going underground to look for something out there, back there, that can be rejuvenating, and also can also be therapeutic. Daryl's paper strikes me forcibly particularly when she talks about one, that poem from Mary Evans is a very significant, very moving poem, I find, with the flow. And she mentioned also the point about commitment to community, and how slave narratives get to recapture that communal spirit, and also the role of Langston Hughes in the whole tradition of getting back to the people, and also drawing from the people the poetry that is so vital and revitalizing. I'm interested also in what she says about the poets of the 60s who moved back into the community in order to teach them revolution, and often alienated or antagonized the very people that they would want to help by exclusion from what they would call the revolutionary circles. I learned a lot from that. I had only suspected that this was the case, but she has reconfirmed my ideas about it. The idea also of moving back into the circle, and also the image of the unbroken circle, that for me holds a lot of meaning. And the healing process, the going back for the healing process to take place, and the laying of hands on the person, and the psychic healing, as she calls it, that comes out of the community. I found most moving, both Daryl and Paul. Thank you very much.
Yeah. Yeah, I'll just say one or two things in response to their very moving presentations. As I listened to both of them, first Paul and then Dr. Daryl, if I may call you, yeah, I was thinking of two things. One was that one is a story I had heard my mother tell of how in the old days, the priestesses at home actually willed themselves to, die, like when somebody became critically ill. I mean, like, there's always a point where they suspect that somebody may just be slipping away. They didn't usually do this for old people who they think in any case ought to be helped to go in peace. But like if a young person or somebody, you don't have to be a baby, but somebody whom the community supposed should not be allowed to die, what the priestess would do, not every priestess, it was a particular skill, and only certain priestesses had the skill, but they would go for the expert, and what she or he, if he was a priest, would do would be to take the potions, nobody knew what these potions were, and will themselves into a trance, and go into a coma for about 3 days, lying down, like without food, without whatever. And the idea was that they would journey into the spirit world and go and sort of investigate what it is that is trying to take away this person in such an untimely manner. And then they would wake up and, come back with a message. And of course, if what they discovered meant that they couldn't save you, they wouldn't say, we can't save you. I mean, but they will still do whatever they can, but they probably would know that you will die. And then if there was anything they discovered which would help them save you, then they saved you. And I mean, I was thinking in terms of these journeys, that sometimes, obviously, in Africa, it is not always even necessary for the sick person, for the lost person, to actually go on the quest, the journey themselves, and that they could, somebody would surrogate for you. And it even happened in situations where people got lost, and so on. Anyway, so that really made me feel somewhat nostalgic at some of these parallels. And I was also especially happy when Daryl brought in Eddie, Edward Braithwaite's name, because he for a long time, he has also symbolized for me the kind of writing, manifested in all of these titles, some of which I know, some of which, I know by having read them myself or by having heard of them, what I'm as a critic beginning to identify as a para-African kind of motif, a certain type of motif, a theme in the writing of Afro-Caribbean peoples, which is almost difficult to come across in Africa now, but seems to is surfacing here, out of racial memory, and because maybe luckily for you, you don't have to deal with some of these cantankerousness that we are having to deal with in Africa. I don't know if I'm coming through, but it is possible to find here in the United States and also in the Caribbean a certain type of writing which is so African it simply shakes you up. And you wonder who is doing this kind of writing in Africa now. You are looking around for it. So for one, I'm just great. Thank you. That's
Yes.
Thank you.
Yes.
At this point, this morning, I stood up and began directing traffic and said, you go, you stop. I think at this point we're a small enough group, and I'm assuming comfortable enough with each other that that's not necessary, and I'll just invite you to jump in as you feel like it. Okay.
You might want to take the lectern out of the way.
Let's do that. Okay, let's burn the lectern.
It's nice. Someone has their hands up.
No hands needed. Go ahead.
Daryl, I was wondering how you account for, or anyone out there, how you would account for what seems to be the different relation that a black woman writer has to the black community, either Afro-American or African, and a black male writer. You were saying or mentioned that in some of the novels about men, when the circle was unbroken, it wasn't the return to the community was not for healing, was not for unification, was not for a sense of holistic identity. How do you account for
As I respond to this, I'm going to be generalizing in a very dangerous manner.
Well, it's a general question I'm inviting you to, and I'll take the burden.
It seems to me that what I see as a difference probably stems from the sense of the difference that men see in defining themselves in a society and that women see in defining themselves in a society. It seems to me that the dilemma that the black male writers, by and large, broad generalization, please excuse me, but it seems to me that their dilemma has to do with operating within the American society or within the Western society and so forth. And they define themselves to some degree on the basis of what a man is in that society. The women certainly are concerned with that dilemma, but it does not seem to be the overriding concern in defining themselves. I think they find satisfaction in finding and defining themselves within the black community. That seems to me to be generally the difference. Ralph Ellison's Invisible Man is an interesting example of that. And while I'm saying this, let me note that there are many, many parallels as well, as I pointed out. Parallels in the sense of dilemma, parallels in what causes the dilemma, because obviously the women and the men suffer under what for many of them is a racist system, and so forth. But Ralph Ellison's Invisible Man seems to me the prime example, and very closely related to this is Dennis Williams' Other Leopards, of the kind of character who is overwhelmed by the fact that he cannot force this larger community to see and recognize and acknowledge him. And he cannot understand what role inevitably he is playing in that community. And so it ends in a kind of frustration with him in the basement hole and Dennis Williams with him up a tree in Africa. Whereas many of the women seem to find at least a certain amount of satisfaction within defining themselves in the black community.
You know, as just sort of a footnote to that, I mentioned how I saw community growing up in terms of women being the caretakers, the sort of bulwark in that community. So that just by way of supporting, you know, your comment, I too sense that women, even though they are subjected to some of the same horrors and have the same struggle for identity and restoration and renewal, yet they have the sense of that world there, which they in a sense create and support and always refer to. That is their point of reference always. Whereas with men, and what it means to be a man, especially in American society and in the world, is all about dealing with that world out there, and a world that's been largely defined by white males. And so it is a different point of reference. And I think that the sense of being truly lost sometimes that you get with many male characters, of not being able to come back and be restored, but left out there on a tree or down in a cellar with 50 million, electric lights, has to do with wrestling with that Goliath and the frustration that brings about. Whereas with the women, you get the sense that their concern, their priority is always in maintaining that community, because that's the lifeline. Mm? And so I think that maybe we get close to why there is the difference there.
I'm wondering if there may be a tendency to operate maybe too monolithic a sense of community. I mean, I agree with what Professor Vance was saying with regard to the struggle that the black male writers are having with regard to the black.
Could you speak a little louder?
Yeah, I'm wondering if perhaps we might be working with too monolithic a sense of community. That question, when you talk about the black community, there's a sense that we sort of know what that means. And perhaps it's a bit more problematic than that. And given the response to the question about why black male writers seem to end up unhealed, I think it's probably true. There's a sense of attempt to straddle two communities in a way in which, at least historically so far, many black women haven't. But I suspect that may well change for the same sorts of reasons that white women tend to see the home as less the locus than they used to as well. So I'm wondering then, is the notion of community here as easily defined as I'm getting the sense that it's assumed to be? For example, we talk about Ellison's valorization of black dialect. I sometimes have a sense that there's a kind of a romanticism going on there, and so one might wonder, is this a prescriptive notion of community? I think it's quite true that the black, in the 60s, black writers had a very prescriptive notion of black community. You're this or you're not black. In a sense, they defined the community as a monolith. And I'm wondering, and obviously I think, I agree that we don't want to do that anymore, but is it so clear just what it is that we're referring to when we talk about the black community and what it is that one wants to return to when we say that's the way to heal?
I think maybe you
Were you directing the question to anybody in particular?
No.
Okay. Obviously, we probably will have as many definitions as we have people in here and extended on. If we had other people respond to this, I was trying to for myself, draw up a definition, which I think I called from the writers whom I was focusing on here. In one sense, when I was talking about black community in terms of the slave narratives, for example, I was talking about blacks in this country, particularly those who were held in slavery, because I think that's the sense of the community that the slave narrators had in mind. In many instances, I was using community to mean all black people in this country, almost, in terms of the black community. When I get to the works that I was focusing on at the end, I was extending that sense of community because I think those writers extend that sense of community. I think all of those that I deal with suggest that the community goes far beyond those who are living here. As Erna Barbara said, you have to walk over the bodies of the living and the dead, and they can either shelter you or form a pit for you. This whole community is much more than present. The matter of time is very important. It's past and it's future. Because, of course, as the protagonist is operating in kindred, when she's back there in slave time, what she is doing is protecting her future, which when we bring her back is the present.
So it's in part an ideal notion, too. It's something that is not in part an ideal notion of community, something that perhaps one might want to struggle for, but in the sense of there being one where there's a consensus among blacks of what it is to be black.
Well, I don't know if you're going to get a consensus as such, and maybe we have to deal with the fact that there are many communities, but also at the same time be aware of the fact that one of the things we're about as a people is the creation of a self that is whole and positive and functional. Because we find ourselves in this kind of crazy existential situation. And you could even sort of see that in a positive way because it gives us the leeway to create the self. And for some, in my case, I chose to look at not only the community, say, in Brooklyn, that was so much a part of my girlhood, to take some ingredients from that would permit me to function. Some others I had to leave aside, the materialism, the insularity, I just left those aside. But I'm talking about the whole process of creating a self. I chose to look toward a larger community
that would include perhaps that world of the West Indies, which I didn't know very much about, aside from what sort of my mother would tell me about, and consciously went out there and kind of tried to understand and embrace it. Again, another step in the process of creating a functional self. I also, well, I've got one third stage. One third stage. And that third stage had to do with maybe trying to just reach out there in a kind of daring leap, like the Igbos walking across the Atlantic, and to embrace that larger world of Africa in a very natural way. It's my origins. And to create, out of all of these different things that I'm drawing upon, these threads, a self. And it is, in many ways, a characteristic American phenomenon. When I go to Europe, all I see are Americans over there looking for their ancestral home, you know. And so it's very American what we're doing, but it's spelled out in terms of what are the ingredients that go into making us. So you can see community in this very varied way. So it's not, you know, I know we've been talking about community here. It's not this sort of monolithic, this one kind of one defined thing. But it's a dynamic, ongoing process.
And let me just make clear, it's defined within the context of each work that focuses on community. In Brewster Place, for example, the community might be said to be simply Brewster Place, though I would argue that that is a microcosm of something else.
You know, it's interesting to hear you talk about creation of community, because I've been sitting here increasingly during the day thinking back to how I began this morning by saying that we had certain purposes in mind. We expected certain kinds of answers. I'm not interrupting you, am I?
Ah, sorry.
But we were open to surprises. And I think what we began by thinking about was the notion that there is traditionally, and one presumes still, a community out there which one may be able to define more easily or less easily, or may have some disagreement about exactly what it is, but that the problem for the writer is established a relationship between him or herself and that community. But increasingly, as I listened to you, it seemed as though, well, the three of you who define yourselves as creative writers were talking about kind of embedding yourself in a community that consisted, at least at the beginning, of other writers, other people doing what you're doing, and perhaps who had gone a bit further, you know, who had gone before you on that path, and finding a community among those people, and coming other creative writers, and coming up with a sense of communal project there, and then seeking the same seeking an audience. And what Daryl was talking about seemed to be in all of the texts that you referred to, a search for community on the part of the writer, a quest for community as something that would be healing if one could find it. So I've been getting a sense that rather than beginning with a sense that you're addressing a community, you know what it is, that the project more or less is to create one.
It's both.
Yeah,
it's both. Absolutely. It is the known. There is the known, there is the given, these communities out of which we come, but there's also at the same time a kind of creation, an extending of the notion of community.
Yeah, and I have one, feeling that, well, I have an idea that, in actual fact, this whole search for one's community, and we are doing it all the time in Africa, although the continent is there, precisely because of the intervention. It's like, where's anything? The thing is that, I don't know, it may be dialectics, yin yang, that sort of thing, the laws of contradiction, that until and unless we, each of us, so-called individuals, actually are able to situate ourselves within certain kind of communities on more or less the local level, we are no good at all for the wider world communities. You know what I mean? We bring nothing to it. And I think, in fact, it is really a very important mission, a revolutionary duty, right? That we are able to find this, the communities are there. I'm not so sure. I'm not so sure that it is just a community of writers, world writers, or anything of the sort. But I genuinely think that that one has to be able to see oneself as belonging to a group, in order to almost realize oneself, and then take all of that back, all of that into the wider national groups, state groups, world groups, because until we do that, we are, it's like Tutola's, the ghost man, the palm one drunkard and his quest. I mean, it's like, the man, the ghost, it's like we are in pieces. And it is only by putting ourselves whole, seeing where it is we are at. It doesn't mean you stay there, but it also means that ultimately, perhaps, that is what is going to empower you as an individual to give of your best to the world community, to the larger community. I don't know that there are any shortcuts, but I'm not, prescribed. I don't think anyone is prescribing anything. Not that I particularly find anything wrong with prescriptiveness, but that's how I view it. That one doesn't have to apologize for looking, for trying, for seeing oneself as belonging to a community. It doesn't hurt.
I have a question. This is anyone on the panel. Anyone find it disturbing that when the media goes to display some black literature, so like what Brewster plays, it is always about the black male being depicted as negative. It's not so much that this shouldn't be written or even displayed, but it seems to be that is always the focus, that the black male is depicting a negative image. Do anyone have a problem with that, or what?
Well, we had a problem with it last night. An ongoing problem. I don't know if you read the Dorothy Gilliam article in the Washington Post. She was sort of an avalanche of letters came in when she said that that was one of the most insulting pieces of television having to do with black males. That and it is troubling, but you have to look at it in a couple of ways. First of all, what Nayla, a writer, set out to do, and what her main concern was, in the novel certainly, was to deal with primarily this group of black women and the ways, the means that they have sort of come to sort of deal with themselves and their lives and what was happening. So that was her principal focus. And yes, I am disturbed at the lack of really significant treatment even of black males. I mean, you never saw one dealt with in the round as a fully developed, multi-dimensional, a fictional portrayal. But again, that has to do with the fact that maybe Nayla's emphasis had to do with women. That was what she was really concerned about. And you're up against a couple of things. First of all, how the country wants to deal with the whole issue of black males. And the fact that a story which was really about black women is turned into somehow a story that in a sense is insulting to and against black males. And that might not really be, but the way it is seen, the way it is interpreted, the way it's responded to, gets you into that. You see what I'm saying? That might not have been, at least in my reading of Brewster's Place, I had the sense that she was really trying to kind of look at a group of women.
Their experiences.
Yes, absolutely. Yes. But how it's been taken.
Yeah.
I mean, no one is talking about that. What we're finding in the response to, especially the television movie, is the treatment of black males.
Well, I think it's because it comes right under the coattails of the color purple. You see what I'm saying? It's just that this is, whenever you see a black male depicted in this type of work, it's always that he is negative and he's always the villain, so to speak. It's not so much that I think that these writers were trying to portray them as that, but it's just that he was always, you don't see the black man kind of being triumphant over the circumstances. He's always,
But did you see Coming to America? What
Yes,
are you
I did.
talking about?
That's a
Baby,
comedy. I agree with you. It's-
what, is comedy not valid?
No, it's not. I mean, yes, it is. But I'm saying that it's with the sense that it's not taken seriously. I understand what you're saying. Yes, that's true. And then you can cite some others. But I'm talking about as far as drama is concerned. It's
Let me respond by saying, first of all, that I agree with you that we do need to be concerned about what kinds of media images we have, and that it is true that often the media, in a very subtle way, creates an image that was not there in the original work. Now, I might set up a gathering of old men for you beside Brewster Place, and there, of course, Gaines was writing about men, and we could argue that there's hardly any portrayal of women in that work, and that when there is a portrayal, the men are putting them down and telling them to get out of the way. That didn't bother me because I knew what Gaines was doing in the work, and I was pleased to see a good drama focusing on males who have a certain strength. And who come out in a rather heroic way there.
Was
and
that
in the
done
same
on
way,
television?
yes,
Excuse me. That was done on
yes.
TV. Yes.
Then we get to Nail, and I think we have the same thing in reverse, but Nail is concerned with a group of women, and I don't think all the male images are completely negative images, but I can understand why some people are concerned that the few images that we do have there are negative images. Now, I am not so concerned when television presents the work with the kinds of images that the author created. And I think they were reasonably close to the images that Naylor created. I am concerned when television and motion pictures and so forth change the images to reinforce the negative images of black people. Let me give you one example. I was appalled at what was done to Raisin in the Sun with Raisin. Now, there, you know Raisin in the Sun, everybody knows Raisin in the Sun. You have this beautiful mother who wants to give her children some privacy and to help them. Now, when they rewrote that for Raisin, they had a scene where she was peeping in to see her son and his wife when they were intimate. That reinforces that snooping woman who will not give her children any freedom, and that's not at all what Lorraine Hansberry had in mind in that play. There they write in a church scene. I have nothing against church scenes, but the media seems to feel that any picture on black light has to have this rocking church scene, and there was jumping all over the place and everything. That seemed to me a mean effort to reinforce some images that whoever did that had in mind about black people, and was so unrepresentative of what the author intended with that work and those characters. It destroyed them for me.
The traffic is getting a little heavy now. I think you've been trying to make a comment for some time.
I think, though, as an answer and a response to that, I think maybe it ought to be taken as an opportunity, especially for black male writers, and the empowerment to change some of those stereotypes and some of those images. This is the opportunity to make those changes that the other gentleman says he feels is coming.
Well, I would like to make two comments. First of all, I think that when Louis introduced this this morning, I was very pleased at the way in which the presentation was made, bringing us to the focus of community and communities. But in the closing remarks that you made, you seem to have been getting away a little bit from his question, or after his question. And I was appalled at Amma for going around now to talk of the world community. I think we have to be very careful. I know that the statement was not made as a major statement, but it was made at the end, throwing it in might create a kind of confusion. because we have to face the fact that the people on this panel this morning and afternoon are brought here as representative of a large community. And I think that in every, at least as far as our reality today goes in the world, this community is our community. If we try to enlarge it or make it larger or whatever, we'll be actually trying to live a lie, I believe. For example, there would not be a time, at least I haven't seen one, where it would be African, Afro-American, and Canadian writers, or African, Afro-American, and white American writers being brought together into a forum, or African, Argentinian, and African American, you know, those combinations. And I think, therefore, the definition of community is there. We don't even, you know, in whatever combinations it is made. I think the word community is something that is most secondary. And the community of world writers is also very secondary. Because at the end of the day, the influence that these people have among themselves, one upon the other, was not an influence, first and foremost, as one writer to the other, actually. I think what they have told us, or what they have shown me, is that Amma, for example, while she was still not a writer, starting out, was influenced by established people. Okay, just like myself now, I'm a writer myself, but a critic first, and I'm getting to be a middle-aged writer now, but I still consider myself as a young writer, you know, in quotes. And Amma has influenced me, we're about the same age, but she has influenced me because she's an older writer than myself. Just like Eskia and even Paul Marshall has influenced me. So that I think that the community, again for the writer, will be those who represent the reality, including the writers themselves. And we are still staying in the black community.
Okay. Can I just defend myself a bit? Okay. Just actually, I think I got myself onto the wrong foot. I was not trying, you know me, I wasn't even trying to put anyone in a world community. I think what I was speaking to, perhaps in the long run, was to myself, because I thought I was reading from Lorenzo's question a certain anxiety, and he is here and he can tell me if I'm wrong, that all this talk about community, which community are you prescribing? Does everybody belong to it? And supposing you create community, what happens to the rest of us? So in actual fact, what I was trying to do is to reassure him that don't worry, let us create, let us create our community. It doesn't violate anything, and that it is only when we are aware of ourselves as belonging to our community that we can even give of ourselves to the rest of the world. And that unless we do that, we are no good to anybody, including ourselves. That's what I was saying. But Lorenzo may want to say that he wasn't anxious at all. But I still wanted to make that remark anyway.
Lorenzo breathing a big sigh.
You do. I'm clapping for myself.
I agree. I was anxious, but not because I felt that there's a sense in which the person should be excluded, but anxious because I think there's a too-ready assumption that a certain community already exists. I just got back from New York, and you walk through Port Authority, and you see the homeless eating and living on the floors of the Port Authority, and you see black for the most part, and you see blacks say on Wall Street who perhaps don't even see these people. My question is, where is the community that we're assuming we're in a sense drawing from and speaking to, in the sense of what's already there?
It's all of that, I think. The community is all of that, isn't it?
Who is an Englishman? The thing is that, Lorenzo, you know, I mean, some of us, you see, it is interesting you are saying that, because I can tell you here that I also belong, you know, supposing I said, let us first of all see the community of, you know, that are contained in division of class, you know, the workers of the world unite. But we, unfortunately, the reason why we cannot say that now is that, to quote Walter Rodney, I mean, poverty has a color now. Do you see? So that even when you look at the world in terms of the working class, in terms of your Wall Street dudes and so on and so forth, we ultimately come to the question of how many people constitute the poor in the country. But of course, I am not even here to defend, community. But we participate in all of this. I mean, do you think that, therefore, somebody is not a black American because, what, he's on Wall Street?
No. I'm saying that there's a tendency when one talks about community with a capital C, I think, to not do justice to divisions which are rather important, which I would like to see in many ways overcome.
I think we are talking about those divisions. I think we really are talking about those divisions within this larger community, because that's one of the things we're wrestling with. How do we heal? How do we bring about the healing within that community? How do we rescue the people that you walk by there sleeping on broken down hamper boxes in Port Authority, in Grand Central Station? We're concerned about them as a part of this larger community, so that within the structure, there are all of these breakdowns. I mean, the buppies down there on Wall Street who might not be aware, yes, of the homeless. They too are part of that community. And yes, it's been a community artificially created by skin color in many ways, and by our position within this republic. I mean, this is the community we're presented with whether we like it or not. And within that, there are all of these breakdowns. That is the community of the widow in my story, this middle-class, middle-aged black woman living up in North White Plains. You see, within that larger world, there is the breakdown. And it's all about how do we bring about the necessary healing.
Did it flash?
In order to salvage that community, to salvage not only the guy sleeping, the family sleeping,
not just the guy.
In the subways, but also to rescue the widow who is strung out on a whole notion about being successful in this society.
Yes.
She needs rescuing also, and healing. So see it in that diverse way within the larger context, and maybe then it won't be such a struggle to understand what we're talking about. I'm not in this camera. I'm going to do a whole paper on this. I thought I would. Or write a poem. That was my first poem ever.
We'll write a poem.
Yes, maybe, Luis, we better.
Well, I'm glad we've resolved that.
Have we?
Yeah, you'll tell me afterwards what it was. Skia has a plane to catch, and so I think maybe we'd better bring this to a halt. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.